Okay, we're going to reconvene the meeting of the Government Oversight Committee. Thank you very much. We have a couple of other members who are joining us and had other commitments. I think they had to do over the break. So they'll be right back, but we are going to start again. And our next invited guest is Suzan Beaudoin, excuse me. Welcome. And I'm going to ask you to raise your right hand, please. You swear that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Can you tell us who you are and what you do, and we'd be pleased to hear any kind of opening statement you might like to make.
I'm Suzan Beaudoin. I'm the Director of School Finance and Operations. I've been the Director since the fall of 2013. I've worked in various positions with the Department of Education since 1984. And I've worked with state government since 1979. I'm a resident of Attleboro and grew up in Augusta.
Thank you. Is there anything you'd like to tell us about your involvement in this matter before some committee members may have questions?
I just want to tell you about how payments in state governments occur.
Sure.
Okay, because it might clarify some things. If it's not an automated, computerized payment system like our state subsidy system, we often have directions, sometimes in law, on how to make these payments. And some of these payments are quarterly. What we do is prepare a manifest, and that manifest goes down into the Fast Service Center to be processed. In past years, manifest in June, because it's the busiest time of year in state government from the close of the fiscal year, may take a month to process. So they're not as inefficient as that anymore with new systems and stuff. The other problem in past years is that first week of July, we used to shut down the whole county system. So that would be an issue about giving somebody some operating money at the beginning of the quarter. In the cases of the Maine School of Science and Math and Back to School for the Deaf, which are two other schools, this is pretty much their operating money, their quarterly payments for the whole operating their schools for those periods. So I just wanted you to be aware of that.
Questions from the committee? Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And could you explain the timing by which they could expect to receive the checks?
Nowadays, it's a lot faster. The state normally does payments on Fridays now, and they process things. Depends on when you send it down there, which Friday it's going to hit. Sometimes if you're lucky, you'll get that Friday, but it may be the following Friday.
So, on the check that was in the works, the manifest was there, and we went and did that pulled back, and that was on the 9th?
Yeah, it probably would have been going out. I've been lucky if it had gone out that Friday, but probably the Friday after.
Okay. And so how many of those checks, how many years had Good Will-Hinckley School at Good Will-Hinckley been receiving those quarterly payments in that manner?
They started in 2012. I believe that's the first year. They went through that with 30,000. Years so I just, like I had that with two schools, I got 40 things, I just processed it at the same time.
No, it's not together.
And so you were in the part of education meeting that was immediately after Commissioner Jordan had the conversation with the governor, which the governor directed him regarding funding, not send Will-Hinckley any money that wasn't required by law. Could you explain to us what the conversation was in your little meeting regarding Good Will-Hinckley? What matters were covered?
It was a very short conversation. He just mentioned that they had a discussion, about the meeting after the cabinet meeting, and a discussion about the Good Will-Hinckley hiring of Speaker Eves. And, not sure if he mentioned that, the governor said, I don't know if it's them who mentioned the funding, but I happened to mention this, that we just sent down a manifest for Good Will-Hinckley, and that's the only one I mentioned. And actually, it's a combination, Good Will-Hinckley, we have one vendor code for that system, so.
Because Good Will-Hinckley doesn't receive money for the state for other things besides the school transportation.
Yes, they have, they actually receive some money for state board, state clients that attend there. That's a different source of funding. They're placed there by IEPs.
But is that actually from the Department of Education?
Yes, that is.
Oh, it is. And that's under the same code as well?
And it's not in the same code, it's the same, it's in the miscellaneous cost category. One of those.
So, if I understand you correctly, and I don't recall whether there's any discussion of the direction from the governor, but pursuant to having heard that Hughes was hired, you're saying that you volunteered that there's a checking process should be holding? Is that
I
what
said,
you're
we
trying to say?
just sent the manifest downstairs to the process. For the meeting.
Are you suggesting that, I mean, would it make any sense to you that if the discussion was about the school hiring someone, the governor was pleased with, that the next response should be immediately, oh gee, there's a payment going out, should we hold it? Has that ever happened regarding any other hiring of executives or displeasure of the governor?
Been working for state government a very long time. You mean in the past year?
If you'd like to qualify it that way.
Thank you. I'm not very good at recalling conversations. Okay, so be aware of that. And the exact verbiage that then acting Commissioner Desjardins had said that day led me to say there's a payment in process.
And you, so you, what you're saying is you really don't recall what the substance of that conversation was that led you to that volunteering that you did. Thank you.
Other questions? Representative Shane.
Thank you, Senator, and boy, am I sympathetic because I can't remember conversations either. But the OPEGA brief suggests that there was some differing recollections from the members of the people who were in the meeting as to what conversations happened and what transpired. I guess the key question is, was it ever discussed that the governor had the potential intention of not paying?
No.
Okay.
Okay.
So there was, what was discussed in your recollection is that the governor's concerned, doesn't like to hire, this is going to get testy, but there was no mention of actually withholding all the funds.
Well,
You're right.
my reflection, my biggest thing in reflection in there is that the acting commissioner paused for a long, long time before he made a decision. And I suspect because we also had on our mind that we did have the cuts coming. We've been discussing that for some time. So we had to make those cuts in that miscellaneous cost category, which this was one of them.
Thanks. Other questions? I'll just get one. Were you ever called to the governor's office to discuss this issue?
No.
Are you aware of anybody else from your office who might have been?
I am not aware of anybody else from my office going to the governor's office for this purpose.
Thank you. Other questions? It's always nice to have a Coney High School graduate here. Representative Kruger.
Who directed you to stop the payment?
I asked the Commissioner Desjardins if he wanted me to hold the payment, hold the manifest. And that's when he paused for a long time and finally said yes.
Were there any subsequent email communications regarding the stop payment?
At that point, I emailed one of my staff to pursue pulling the payment, and I believe we have copies of those.
But there was nothing from administration side other than your staff?
No.
Did you or anyone on your staff speak directly with the governor or the governor's office, or was it all with the commissioner?
I only spoke to the commissioner.
Have you ever withheld a payment like this before involving gas or?
I've pulled payments before, yeah, for many different purposes, so.
Were other payments from the miscellaneous account made around this time?
Yes, we did make the payments to Maine School of Science and Math and the Maine Center for Deaf and Hard of Hearing. However, I did not give them a full payment because the budget hadn't passed yet. So I did them a partial payment.
Thank you.
Other questions? Senator Diamond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. Welcome. Coney High School, sir?
UMA, UMO too.
Used to be a rivalry between Dartmouth and Coney, but that's.
Somebody?
At the meeting with the long pause,
Yep.
following that meeting, did you ever have further discussions with the acting commissioner on this issue? And if so, what was that, what were those discussions about?
Not specifically on this issue. We had a discussion on July 7th about cuts, having to do the 1.5 million plus other cuts where we had to do an miscellaneous cost category.
Okay, but nothing specifically to this issue that we're talking about today, no discussions with the acting commissioner at all. Thank you.
Representative Sparkio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So when you had that meeting on the 7th to discuss the cuts,
None.
of the 9th, July 9th it was?
June 9th.
June 9th.
Oh, July 7th for the cuts.
So yeah, you just said that that's the next time we really discussed it. Was Good Will-Hinckley mentioned at that point?
All the pieces in that section were mentioned, so they were not
So
alone.
can you tell us what the discussion was on why Good Will-Hinckley should not be cut at that point?
At that time, we had more information on its connection to the Alphon funding and the need for the residential facility. The fact that we discovered there was not a contract in place. So we had a lot more information at that point in time.
So the fact that the speaker had been fired and was no longer in the running to be the president of the Hinckley was never mentioned at all. That was
Not at
never
that
brought up.
meeting, no, we had other things to do on that meeting.
Any further? Senator Johnson.
Mr. Chair, I just want to follow up on that. When and from whom did you learn that RPs had been fired?
I probably learned it from the paper, just like everybody else, so when it had been fired, so that's on the news.
And were there discussions of that matter with your peers in the Department of Education prior to that budget meeting we just discussed?
I don't recall any discussions having to do with that.
Thank you. Representative Kruger.
Thank you again. I appreciate your coming. Was it your feeling in your conversations with Commissioner Desjardins that his direction was coming from the governor?
No.
This was him. Okay, thank you.
Seeing no further questions, thank you. Did you, I have to ask, did you produce all the documents you were requested?
Yes, I did.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for being here. Next person is Rich Abramson. While he's on his way up here, I know that Senator Diamond is a graduate of Gardner High School. He was so busy this fall, I wasn't able to see who won the County Garden League.
My sense is you did see it.
He has a very sharp memory. The evidence is smarter than
You have to ask me, can you please raise your right hand? Do you swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
it will be.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I've got a couple of questions to ask you if I can, and just for everybody's benefit before we do you have any opening statement you'd like to make?
No, I listened to a lot of the testimony this morning. I don't have anything right now that I could add. The other questions will be forthcoming.
And just for everybody's knowledge who's here from the public, everybody talking to this afternoon has previously been interviewed by OPEGA. So we've already got some information on the involvement and recollection of everybody who will be here this afternoon. So hopefully the questioning will go more quickly than it did this morning as a result. So I wanted to just focus on a couple of things if I could. And one of them was June 5th. And as I understand it, you received a call from the governor that day. Do you recall that?
Correct, I do.
Okay, could you tell us about that conversation? How long it lasted and what you recall about the conversation?
I received notice from my secretary that the governor was going to be calling my cell phone. And shortly thereafter, my cell phone rang and it was the governor. We did have trouble connecting. He ended up being disconnected twice while we were talking, which didn't help the conversation at all. I did receive a call from the governor, told him how pleased I was that he was calling, and he informed me that he was extremely upset. He had recently learned that Good Will-Hinckley had offered the position and hired Mark Eves as the next president of Goodwill. He talked to me about the concerns that he had for Mark, particularly around his voting record, asked whether or not, as part of the process, we looked at Mark's voting record, which I informed him we didn't. We tried as diligently as we could to be nonpartisan through this whole process. It was obvious that the governor was upset with Good Will-Hinckley, with the board, certainly with me for having led the process. I tried as hard as I could to explain to the governor the process that we had followed, that we started with 19 candidates. It had been a 6 to 7 month process. We winnowed that down. I explained the last 4 candidates, the process that we took those 4 candidates through, getting to 2 candidates that we brought to the board, the senior leadership team, the parents, the students, that everyone was unanimous in their feeling that Mark should be the next president. That didn't mean much to the governor. He was still pretty upset and voiced that concern to me. He did share as part of that conversation that he had been a big proponent of Maine Academy of Natural Sciences, and that if we were making this type of decision that we would be losing his support. I reminded him that we had invited him to come and speak at graduation this summer. I talked to him again what he wanted me to do, that I worked for the board. The board followed a very straightforward process. He shared with me a couple of people that he thought we should have considered who did not apply. The people that he had suggested, I knew them to be retired. I told him that I thought they would be excellent candidates, but they did not apply for the position. The conversation ended. I asked if there was anything more that he would like me to do. He said no. And the conversation ended. It was probably a 15-minute conversation when we were finally able on landlines to connect with one another.
Do you recall anything more specific that he might have said in terms of his saying that you have lost my support?
No, and I was very sensitive to that. Well aware of the support that he has provided to the school over the years. Having met with him in April and talking about how appreciative the school was of the support that he had provided, the funding for the residential component of Good Will-Hinckley. Talk about some of the good things that we have done on. No mention of money. It merely was, you have lost my support if we move forward with this decision.
That same day, did you receive a call from Sara Vanderwood?
I did.
And she is who? Sara is your relationship?
Main Street Solutions is the lobbying firm that has in the past worked with Good Will-Hinckley and was currently working with Good Will-Hinckley. Sara called and informed me that she had been called to the governor's office, that news of Mark's hiring was disclosed in I believe, a Republican caucus that morning. The governor got word that morning. I I informed her that I had been called by the governor. She was aware of that. And she was called to the governor's office. And again, she pretty much reiterated that we, if we move forward, would lose the governor's support. And I believe at that, in that conversation, the funding was in question at that point. And Sarah relayed that to me.
Thank you. Other questions for Mr. Abramson? Senator Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd like a couple of questions to follow up. So going back to your conversation with the governor on the phone on June 5th, you said that he described how he'd been a strong supporter over time. And at one point when you were going back to describing that, you mentioned the funding. So I want to know, how was it he communicated that he had been a strong supporter of the school? Did he discuss the funding that had previously been provided at his?
When I met with the governor in April, of which Sara Vanderwood was part of that meeting, Jack Moore was part of that meeting, Karen Chadbourne was part of that meeting, I made known to the governor that I was aware that the funding that was being provided through the Department of Education was time limited, and that part of my responsibility was to develop a plan on how we would continue with providing the residential component with not using the state funds. I knew that there was a promise made to the governor that that time frame would be limited. And I was reporting to him at that meeting that I've begun building that plan, working with the board and our finance department and our recruiters to address how we were going to do it. It was not specific, but I did want him to know that we were aware that the funding was time limited, no specific date given, but that we needed to begin building a plan for how we would continue to provide that program without that support.
How would you characterize the governor's description of his being a strong supporter?
In my office, there's a picture in my former office. There's a picture.
Back this up a little. In your phone conversation on June 5th with the governor.
I reminded him of our conversations, my willingness to work with his office and building a forestry program in partnership with the community college system and the loggers that he was talking with. We talked about that at our April meeting. I brought that up again, reminded him that we were willing to do that, help hold a convocation at Good Will that would allow him that opportunity to have a place to meet and bring people together. I reminded him of the picture of the first graduating class that was in our office. I presented him with a copy of that picture on that April date. I reminded him of the fact that we invited him to come and be part of the graduation for the class of 2015. All things that we had discussed earlier, just to let him know that we were well aware of the support that he had provided in the past and that we continue to value that support.
And so when the governor said, by making this decision, we'll be losing his support, what did you take that to mean?
First, I was really taken aback by the fact that I was getting a call from the governor on a Friday afternoon or Friday morning. Well aware of the funding that we had, not sure whether it was specifically related to the funding, is not coming to be part of graduation, that he would not continue to want to be affiliated with Maine Academy. Those were some of the things going through my mind while we were having this conversation.
So would it be correct to characterize that as there were multiple aspects going through your mind when he said that, but you weren't sure at that point what he meant by
correct
support? And so the second question was to the conversation you subsequently had that day with Sara Vanderwood. She called you and you disclosed that it had been, the hiring had been disclosed at a Republican caucus, and you characterized part of that conversation as saying that she knew the funding to be at risk.
Yes.
Can you provide more detail what it was she said?
It was a very short conversation. She relayed that she had been called to the governor's office I believe she said Aaron Chadbourne had met with her. She did not meet with the governor, and that our funding was in jeopardy. I believe also in that conversation, we talked a little bit about how that really puts us in a very awkward position, but she encouraged me to continue to move forward, not knowing whether it was or was not going to be withheld, and that the board should not be intimidated in changing its decision.
When did that belief that you could proceed change to determination that you had to fire Speaker Eves if you're going to keep your funding?
There were several meetings, I'm sorry,
Do you recall when that transpired?
the following Tuesday or Wednesday, I believe the call from the governor was on a Friday. I believe the following Tuesday, Robert Moody, who was Vice President of Operations, James Jerdak, who was Vice President of Finance, and myself had a phone conversation with Jack Moore about the phone conference that I had with the governor, Sarah's call to me, and we talked about holding a phone conference with the executive committee members of the Good Will-Hinckley board to talk about what was unfolding and to get their sense of whether or not to continue to move forward. There was a phone conference. I was not part of that phone conference. James Jerdak was, discussing the conversation with the governor, the call from Sara, the potential of loss of funding, and where the board had already, at that point, pretty much made its decision, what the next steps of that should be. And the result of that was communicated to me is that the officers and the members of the executive committee of Good Will-Hinckley decided to continue to move forward with negotiating the contract and getting a signature from Mark on his contract and moving forward with the board's decision. The next meeting was of the board. I think it was a week or two later, and a number of things had happened at that point. We had an opportunity to meet with Mark. Mark was aware of what was unfolding at that point, came to the board essentially with a plan of how to address that loss of funding. And at that board meeting, Jack presented to the full board a copy of a letter from the Alphon Foundation that he had received, indicating that with the loss of state funding, that a whole series of events might be triggered as a result of that. First, that we would lose $530,000 each year for 2 years of funding. That would put us in a different financial status and some of the parameters that the Alphon Foundation were holding our feet to the fire for. If we would need to go through another financial audit and scrutiny by the Alphon Foundation to make sure that we could sustain that flow, and if not, the possibility of their not continuing to provide the rest of the funding was in jeopardy, and that would potentially trigger, as Jack explained, I think in his earlier testimony, the possibility of a default on a bridge loan that we had secured from Farm Credit East. So all of this was laid out for the board and for Mark at that board meeting.
And that was the June 18th letter
From the Alphon Foundation.
from the Alphon
Yes.
Foundation, in which they cited certain assumptions, such as continue to receive the state funding for residential programs. And so are you saying that at that meeting, a week or two after June 9th, after having received that Harold Alphon Foundation letter, is when the board changed their mind?
At that meeting, the board had a discussion with Mark about, A, the potential loss of state funding, which he was aware of, and came to that meeting with a plan on how he would address that, coming to the job essentially on July 1st. And Mark became aware of the Alphon letter at that meeting. Was not aware of it prior to coming in. I was not aware of the letter. The board was not aware of the letter.
So, and it's my understanding that it was subsequent to that, it was a number of days later that the board actually made its decision.
Correct. It was
to
after
fire him.
that board meeting.
So we haven't yet gotten to how that occurred. If we could keep going with your description of it. Subsequent to that meeting in which Speaker Eves had a plan and made some communications based on that, I assume. At what point did it change from that to a decision that the board had to fire some students?
All I can talk about is that particular board meeting, because I was ending my tenure as interim president at that point. Mark and Jack left the board meeting to talk. The board was very clear with Mark, saying this is the status of what we are now facing. Essentially, there are two considerations that we would ask you to consider. One is, do you wish to be part of a potentially sinking ship, or do you want to withdraw your application as president of Good Will-Hinckley? Jack and Mark left the board meeting. The board remained. Jack talked with Mark and asked him to think about it over the weekend and to make contact with him Sunday or Monday the following to let him know what his decision would be. That's as far as I got in the process. Essentially, the 25th of June was my last day at Good Will-Hinckley.
So that we can't quite get to that point, and I understand that. I appreciate your sharing what you know. So would it be correct to characterize that what made the Will-Hinckley board certain that threat was a very real possibility? Obviously, these are very serious discussions here just related about whether to withdraw an application in reference to a sinking ship. It hinged on the information that came your way from conversation with Sara Vanderwood based on her meeting with Aaron Jack.
Correct. And Jack, at the board meeting, talked with the full board and Mark about the conversations that he had with Acting Commissioner Tom Discharge. Part of my recollection of that conversation were questions from members of the board. If we did not move forward with Mark's contract, would the state funding be returned? Would the Alphon audit and subsequent grant, would the audit go away and would the potential grant remain? And Jack relayed to the board that in his conversations with the commissioner and the Alphon Foundation, that would in fact occur.
So I want to turn to, lastly, to the letter, Harold Alphon Foundation. And that for you, I understand, is what made this not from just directing you to take seriously, realizing what the full financial implications would be. Do you know anything about how Harold Alphon Foundation became aware that the state funding for the residential program was at risk? Because this is so far in our timeline, this is not something that has been discussed or made public in any way at that point. Did you have any conversations with anyone other than the information in this letter that would inform you of what knowledge Harold Alphon Foundation's letter was based upon?
I believe Jack reported to the board that it was in conversation with Alphon that they had received contact from the governor's office. That's how they became aware of the loss of state funding, the potential loss of state funding.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? Representative McClellan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm on the education committee, and we meet here, so it's always great to say the Good Will-Hinckley program is amazing. You know, I was
Thank
there
you.
when this all kind of got going, and you guys do a great job. So, in all this muck, it's important to say that.
Is your representative? I don't think you're right.
No, it's not, you're right. Should I say it all again? Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just pointing out the Good Will-Hinckley program is awesome, and I think in all this muck, that should be pointed out every chance we get. I had a couple questions. One just struck me, maybe because you're here. We had testimony today, and I think in the documents from your financial officer saying in the beginning of this process, you know, the money wasn't that big a deal. And that just strikes me, is that just not someone not having forethought, or why would someone make that?
Actually, that statement is a little bit inaccurate. I think when the Ethics Committee contacted Good Will-Hinckley, talking about the speaker wanting to know whether or not his voting on the budget would be an ethics issue, compromise. I believe in that conversation that Mr. Jordak said that if we lost that $530,000, what would go away is the residential component of Good Will-Hinckley. That's what was funding kids from all across the state being able to be in that charter school. Two separate programs. That's a Good Will-Hinckley program, and if that went away, it certainly would compromise somewhat our ability to recruit students from far away that wanted to be part of that Maine Academy program. And I believe, and what was relayed to me by Mr. Jordak, is that that's what he pointed out to the Ethics Committee. If that money were not to be provided, it would have an impact on the residential component, potentially down the road have an impact on our kids and our ability to recruit other students. But we certainly were not then or any time in the past in a position that $530,000 could easily be taken away and not have an impact on what we provide.
And in fairness, that most of your kids are. You have a lot of residential kids.
We have a fair number of residential kids, and I know there were plans this year to make available at least 1 or 2 nights a month for all kids to be able to experience the family life that was provided through the cottages and being able to stay on the campus. That was part of what we were looking to expand this coming year.
Thank you. So I guess I have 2 questions otherwise. The word threat has been bandied about a lot for months. I mean, this was back in June, I think. So I guess I'm just trying to understand the definition of threat. Was the threat that we're all taking from this a spoken direct, you know, if you do A, we're going to do B, or was it a perceived threat? I'm disappointed in you, I've lost confidence in you, and then you guys did the math and figured out, wow.
The initial conversation I had with the governor, the only conversation I had with the governor recently, was not if A, then B. It was more, you're losing my support, and it wasn't clarified as to what that support would be. Jack Moore's conversation with the board very clearly said, and what I heard from Sara Vanderwood that afternoon, that the loss of funding was a very real possibility, and most certainly would be moving forward. I think those are the 2 pieces, that if A, then B. And it wasn't if A, because A had already happened. The board of Maine Academy, in conjunction with the board of Good Will-Hinckley, had already taken its vote. It was a unanimous vote of the board. The contract was being offered to Mark, so he had been essentially hired at that point. So that's how the board, and I think I took Jack's communiques and conversation with the board.
Okay. And I guess, and I think you probably answered, but so you didn't ask back what loss of support means, but you found out through other sources?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Last question, kind of multifaceted. Unfortunate thing with this, I think, is people's names are in the paper, and you know, everybody here is human and good. But I want to ask you about the process, which I guess I didn't, that you led, you said. When I saw the job description, it was pretty challenging, I thought. And I think I heard today something, and I know it's in the paperwork, there were 19 applicants that you looked at seriously. I assume it was more than that, or was it 19?
No, there were 19 that completed the process.
Okay. And that's a
Completed the
national search?
paperwork. It was a national search.
Okay. Somewhere in media, when this was all gone, because I don't know if you guys, but for me, the most, early on, I was getting it from the paper like everybody else, just following it in the paper. And I saw a side-by-side of the 3 resumes of President Cummings, and I assume yours was the other one, and then Speaker Eves' resume. And it did, it looked like he maybe lacked qualifications, given what you and your predecessor offered. And I guess, since you were so involved in the process, if all the resumes had been handed to you with no name on them, if you just saw the resume, do you think you still would have interviewed Speaker Eves?
I believe I would, name not being there, but the fact of state government, the efforts of public service that were provided, the family counseling background, I think were all attributes that would have led me to certainly say this person should move through the process. I did not have a say in who gets selected or who moves through the process. My job was to guide the process. I saw that, I think it was the Bangor Daily where, surprised, my resume appeared in the newspaper, not with my permission.
Very impressive,
but
by the way, yes.
Thank you. What Good Will-Hinckley was experiencing at this point in its history was the need for somebody that could open doors in foundations, that could meet with people, that could bridge the gap for a pretty dark period of history in Goodwill's past. Things were coming out, the school was being built, rehab, good things were happening, and I think the board very clearly was looking for somebody that would be that public face. And I think that's what really helped the speaker through the whole process, is that the board felt at this point in its history, he was the right person for the job. And did have some of the characteristics and traits, not everything. Rarely do you find that person that walks through with everything you're looking for, but had those particular skills and traits that the board felt would really help keep that movement moving forward.
Thanks for being here. You're welcome.
Thank you. Senator Burns.
Good afternoon, Mr. Steve.
Good afternoon.
I'm going to continue a little bit with my question, just said since this whole thing broke, I've been kind of curious about the process. I'm not curious about the process. And so one of the questions I had was, as you watched the board deliberate, what was the amount of time that they actually deliberated on this particular candidate, Mr. Reeves? How long? Are we talking hours, days?
I would say, I believe you have the process that was set forth and who was involved in that process. If I could just walk you through that process quickly, we started with phone interviews. After the search committee went through the 19 applications and determined essentially 12 people that would be part of a phone interview. The search committee from there decided who would go moving forward to an interview with the senior leadership team, have an opportunity to visit the campus. It was essentially a half-day full meeting. Search committee again deliberated after those 4, heard from the senior leadership team, heard from the staff at the Maine Academy of Natural Sciences, heard from parents, heard from students who were all part of that process. From that 4, 2 were recommended to come and be fully interviewed by both boards, the Maine Academy of Natural Sciences Board and the Good Will-Hinckley Board. They were done simultaneously, and then they would swap after approximately an hour. I would say the final 2 candidates had easily a full day's worth of interviews, campus visits, tours of the campus, interviews by boards, interviews by senior leadership team, at least, I would say, 8 hours worth of time to get to those final two.
Okay, I appreciate that, that's the process. How about after the swap took place, how about the actual deliberation and discussion period? This last
I think each board probably spent a good 45 minutes in discussion, and then the two boards came together. There was some discussion when the two boards came together as to who was the legal authority to make the decision. And looking at our bylaws, it was the Good Will-Hinckley board that employs the president, and that person then oversees one of the programs, which is Maine Academy of Natural Sciences. But Chairman Moore worked very hard to make sure that everybody had an opportunity when the two boards came together to do their final deliberation. Everybody had an opportunity to offer their perspective of the interviews and the final two candidates.
My understanding from Mr. Moore, he presented to this committee, was that the board was focused to a great degree on outward-facing candidates. And I think I heard you reiterate the same thing just a moment ago. Even though I believe you determined you already had his predecessor who left outward-facing. I guess I'd ask you, what was the priority of the board then, or percentage of priority on that versus credentials? What weight did they give each of those in that 45-minute discussion?
I would say a great deal of time and effort was spent on who among the final two candidates could best represent both organizations, the Maine Academy as well as Good Will-Hinckley, who had the most experience. One was a Maine person, another person was from away. The board was also deliberating on how much time would be spent in a honeymoon period, catching up on everything that was going on, anticipating that the second candidate would take a lot more time to hit the ground running than Speaker Reeves would. Those were part of the conversations that were part of the board's deliberation.
I'm going to try to rephrase the question a little bit then. Okay. Those two particular aspects of qualification, credential, experience with education, those types of things, versus the ability to raise funds or interface with administration, legislature, other people. Which one of those weighed the most?
The outward-facing face of Good Will-Hinckley fundraising, without a doubt. Part of that, if I could, is that the board had great confidence in the senior leadership team, that we didn't need an educational leader. We had a very strong principal running the Maine Academy of Natural Sciences, very strong director of the Glenn Stratton Learning Center, very strong person running the College Step-Up program. And if it's not broke, it doesn't need to be fixed. What we do need to do is to re-cement our image in the community across the state. We need to raise additional funds. We had a capital project that was underway that needed additional funding and support, and that was the most important characteristic that both boards thought of at that point.
Thank you for that answer. One other question. When Speaker Reeves indicated to the board that he had a good working relationship with the administration, was there any questioning of that? How did that go? Was that?
I know that there was a concern, a number of the things that have been discussed today. The fact that he's living in southern Maine, the program is based in central Maine. The importance of being on campus and being visible. How much time was the legislature going to take for their ability? Those were some of the questions that he was asked. He was asked about his relationship with the governor, and I remember him saying very clearly it is a respectful relationship. He's a Democrat, the governor is a Republican. They do not always see eye to eye, but what he did share with the board is that he would hope that the governor would say, don't agree with you, but I respect the position that you hold. That was talked about quite a bit. He because again, just the points that I made earlier, you know, Mark needed to finish his second term as speaker, but he felt that he could balance that. He was successful in making sure that the board understood that and how he would address that. And the board was comfortable with that prior to making the decision to hire him. But those were discussed.
Thanks, sir.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Campbell.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it's been a little time with Glenn at Hinckley, and really have a lot of respect for what you've done with the KDCC campus and providing sustainable future for our citizens. I guess in terms of the process, it was mentioned here that, and Mr. Moore mentioned that it's really nonpartisan, non-political. And you mentioned earlier that you really didn't know that the speaker didn't support charter schools. And in terms of Mr. Moore's description of how the job description evolved, it's evolved with the applicants to come to. And I guess I asked him, did the board have a little dialogue? You mentioned probably more than Mr. Moore said concerning the speaker's concern about time management and so on. It just appears to me that the fact that he didn't really support charter schools and the fact that the evolution of the job description came to a point where Mr. Moore said, this particular applicant speaks well, politician speaks well, and he raises funds. So fundraising was a big point. Did it ever occur to the board that his ability to fundraise was basically from charter school opposition, unions and the like, instead of in general? Was there any dialogue about, we talked about foundations and such, but sometimes, and with term limits, speakers don't have the length of time to raise money beyond their term, ever occurred to the boards?
The board in its discussion, particularly with Mark, talked about asking him specifically to talk about what fundraising experience he had. And fundraising experience he related was most recently his candidacy as a representative and speaker. He talked about that. But he also talked about some of the nonprofit organizations that he had worked with and some of the fundraising he had done on their behalf as well. And that resonated, I believe, with the board at that point.
Thank you. Representative Mastracchio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Mr. Edmondson, for coming today. Follow up on that, though, did you really, it was a unanimous vote by the board to hire the speaker. And let me just ask you this, I asked Mr. Moore, absent the interference and the suggestion that funding would be not forthcoming, would the Speaker of the House, the current Speaker of the House, currently be President Good Will-Hinckley, in your opinion?
Without a doubt. And if I could qualify that, once Mark had signed the contract and was clearly the person moving forward with that presidency, it was a great pleasure of mine to be able to try to work with him and start to bring him up to speed as we were approaching that July 1st date. He wanted very much to be well aware of what conversations were underway, what were the things, what were the challenges he was going to face. We talked about some of the fundraising challenges that Good Will-Hinckley had. We talked about some suggestions that he had thought about from the time he was interviewed to the time he decided to our meeting. He and I had several phone conversations. He would come out of legislative session, it might be 7 o'clock at night or later that we'd have these, but was truly excited and thrilled with being able to move into this position. So that's a long answer to a personal belief on my part, and I think the board's part, that he would, absent interference, be the president of Good Will-Hinckley right now.
Can I just follow up?
Yes, sir.
And in your opinion, you'd have done an exemplary job
I received a phone call from my office saying that Commissioner Disjardin was trying to get in touch with me and wanted to talk. And I called the cell phone that was given to me, and I connected with Tom. And he told me that he was going into a meeting with the governor the next morning and wanted to follow up on the conversation that the governor and I had about a forestry initiative that the governor was very interested in, and thinking that Good Will-Hinckley would have a very good chance of helping him with this initiative. And I told him what had transpired since the meeting with the governor and where we were. Essentially that the ball was still in the governor's court. There's no specific date or invited audience had been identified. But I reminded the commissioner at that point, I said, you realize that you will be dealing with somebody taking my place, that my time is limited at Goodwill. I told him that I came off the board at Goodwill and became the interim president just to fill a gap, that we had hired somebody, we'd be moving forward, and that he would be working with somebody new. The conversation from there said, well, we'll probably have to wait till the legislature adjourns. To me, indicating that he had a pretty good idea of who. I figured maybe I had done something wrong and violated the confidentiality that was entrusted upon me by sharing information that got to him. But it was pretty clear that he knew who Good Will-Hinckley was going to be moving forward. And I think his final comment is, well, I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens. And that was the end of the conversation. The next day, I received a call from the governor. So I'm assuming that Mr. Disjardin and the governor did have a conversation at that point, which resulted in a call.
Thank you, Representative. Senator Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here.
You're very welcome.
I'm trying to get a little more specific handle on what you came away with after you had that telephone conversation with the governor. You said he was upset, but and he didn't mention anything about funding. He was upset. What kind of upset? Did he simply say, I'm upset, or was the tone much more aggressive than that? Can you give us a feel so I can understand how you were feeling when you finished the conversation?
There was a few profanity words that were used in describing the speaker and the speaker's work that I'm not going to share with you today, but he wasn't yelling and screaming at me. He let me certainly try to explain what process we had gone through, but it was very clear in his tone that he wanted to make a point, that he was very upset and not happy with my decision, the board's decision, Good Will-Hinckley's decision to move forward with the speaker. And he talked about the lack of credentials, the lack of support. I looked at his voting record, those types of things. And then saying, why didn't you consider this person or that person? So
Profanity and other sorts of words you don't want to share today, they were directed at the speaker?
talking about the speakers, yes.
Okay. The other question I have is, we heard today, and we've seen it in the report, that Mr. Moore told Mr. Disjardin that he was not pleased with the selection of the speaker as president. But he had obviously voted because he was unanimous vote. Did Mr. Moore ever relate his displeasure to the board, even notwithstanding the fact that he voted for it? Did you have an idea that Mr. Moore was upset and not pleased with that selection?
I had several conversations with Jack Moore through the search process, and some of the questions about time commitment, relationship with the governor, how do you run an organization such as Good Will-Hinckley, being Speaker of the House and living in southern Maine. Some of those conversations took place. Prior to the final two candidates moving forward to the board, the board chair and I had a conversation, and Jack wanted to privately reach out to Mark to meet with him to get comfort in answers to those questions. He didn't feel that Mark answered those questions to his satisfaction through the interview process. I reminded the chair that we had to be consistent. We could not really deviate from the process, so if he was going to meet with Mark he also needed to have that same conversation, ask the same questions of the second candidate. And the meeting did take place. I insisted if he wouldn't have me be present, that the vice president needed to be present, so there was a witness that could attest to what took place at that meeting. Those two informal meetings with Jack, Rob Moody, the vice president, and the two final candidates did take place before the board had its final vote. And Jack related to the board that as a result of those two meetings, he was comfortable with moving Mark's nomination forward. You're welcome.
Further questions? Yes, Representative Duchesne.
Thank you, Senator. In the world of fundraising, and especially for schools, nonprofits, it's not unusual to have somebody express their disappointment by withdrawing their support if a decision's been made that they didn't like. It's not common, but it's not unprecedented. Have you ever seen a case where someone contacts other supporting foundations, donors, supporters, to try to chill their support?
No, I have experienced what you described,
Yeah.
where you might have, I know that as a result of this whole situation, we had a number of alums, excuse me, alums express their displeasure and told us that they were withdrawing their support, whether it's a gift or a donation.
But it would be uncommon for them to contact other supporters and try to chill them as well.
Not that I'm aware of.
When you voted to go ahead anyway, knowing that this controversy was swirling around a little bit, did the Alpine Foundation letter come as a surprise to you?
It did.
Yeah.
Questions, Representative Bongiorno?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one thing I thought of. Did I hear you correctly that the governor's office, in your understanding, the governor's office is the one that informed the Alpine Foundation?
That's what I was told.
And that was from, who told you that yet? You don't-
I think Jack Moore, in his conversation with the Alpine
No
Foundation.
direct knowledge of who in the governor's office.
Other questions? It's been, I know you were still at
Sorry. Caught with Tom, the dragon has.
Right?
I'll try.
I know I assume you're still in touch with your former colleagues at the school, and we didn't ask them this question, but where do they stand with the selection process now for a new president? Do you know?
They have gone through a new search, and they have put that search on hold for the moment because there is dialogue going on with two very strong nonprofit organizations to see if there's some synergy. And I think they want to let that process work through before moving forward with the selection. My understanding is that they were down to 2 or 3 candidates.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. And I've asked everyone, if you produce all documents that we asked, please.
I did.
Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Councilor. Thank you. Our next requested person is Mr. Brown. Bill Brown?
I'm sure Bill is here, you were going to give him, I thought there was another order.
I apologize.
Yeah, the 19th is a big deal. It's not going to be normal. We're going to have to speak lunch and stuff, so if I can get it down, it'll be nice. I agree that I got
Good afternoon. Can you tell us who you are, what you do, and any open you want to answer some questions? Thank you.
Senator Cage, Representative Kruger, members of the committee. My name is Sara Vanderwood. I'm a resident of Oxford, and I work as a government affairs consultant for Main Street Solutions, Arizona. And I was the lobbyist for Good Will-Hinckley at the time that this issue came about.
Anything else you'd like to say? Questions from the committee? Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Vanderwood may have been present in the room for the last interview, and in which it was stated that first awareness that lack of support really do represent funding integrity. Was heard from you, and you tell us more about, and suggested that that was based on meeting with Aaron Shepard.
Sure.
Tell us about that.
On the morning of June 5th, I actually got a call on my way into the office from Aaron, and I was asked to come to his office as soon as I got to the State House. And I left on my way that day, so as soon as I was in the State House, I did reach out to him. And I went into the office and he asked me if Speaker Eaves had been hired by Good Will-Hinckley as the president. I had no knowledge of it. It wasn't something that Good Will-Hinckley had kept me apprised of. But I told him that I would certainly find out if that were the case, and went about trying to find that out. I called Rich Abramson, got voicemail, was able to talk to him later on, and he did confirm that that was the case. I had also talked to my colleague who works at the firm and was a member of the Good Will-Hinckley board. In the conversation that I had with Aaron, he said that the governor was very upset if it was Speaker Eaves that had been selected, that the speaker wasn't qualified to hold the position either educationally or from a perspective that he had been a vocal opponent of charter schools. And I believe it was also stated that the governor knew the at-risk population very well for students, and his brothers had come from that background, and that Speaker Eaves would be incapable of handling a group of at-risk students, and that the governor had been very supportive of Good Will-Hinckley in the past, and that he did not think that that support would continue if Good Will-Hinckley hired Speaker Eaves as their president.
And so, can you describe how or at what point it became apparent to you sufficiently that you conveyed that to other people, that what was meant by that was funding was in jeopardy?
I mean, yes, there have been statements made that the governor had been supportive of Good Will-Hinckley in other ways, that he had been to the school, he had been to commencement. I mean, it is very clear that the governor, that this population of students was very important to the governor, but to me, the issue of support was directly related to funding. And it seemed very clear to me, without funding being specifically mentioned, that that's what support meant. And I would relay that to Rich Abramson.
And has any other conversations or communications that you've had from the governor's office have people supported that conclusion, or give you any reason to hesitate in that assessment being correct?
No, funding has never been specifically mentioned. It was always couched as support, but no, there was nothing that was ever said or done that makes me question my assessment.
Thank you. Representative Campbell.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that. So how did it come to your mind that it was funded? Have you been here through the morning?
I have.
It didn't appear to be that specific to them, but how did it become so specific to you?
I mean, it's an issue that I've been working on for Good Will-Hinckley since 2012. It was originally why I was brought on to lobby for Good Will-Hinckley, was because there was cuts proposed in the 2013-2014 biennial budget, if I'm remembering my dates correctly. The residential money was going to, that there was a consideration of that money being cut in that budget. I was brought on to try to, as a Republican, to try to keep that money in the budget. I did meet with the governor and several Republican members, both from the Senate and the House, in December of 2012. So my sole purpose for Good Will-Hinckley was to make sure that that money stayed in the budget, and I had had conversations with Aaron Chadbourne leading up to it, and I think he understood that that's what my role was. I mean, Good Will-Hinckley doesn't lobby a lot of other issues. It's a funding issue that we typically lobby for.
So you were basically the liaison between the legislature and the school.
Yes.
But we heard very specifically that funding wasn't mentioned, and from Mr. Jordan that there were other elements. So how did you so quickly get to funding?
that was the impression that I was given, was that it was about the funding.
Representative Mastracchio and then Representative Shane. I'm sorry, I saw her first.
Is there any doubt at all in your mind that the funding was threatened because the working on hired a speaker, and then the funding was restored because then it was hired? No. Thank you.
Representative DeShane.
Thank you, Senator. Both Mr. Chamberlain and Desjardins said they didn't really mention money, but they spoke to you, or at least both of them did, right?
Mm-hmm.
You are essentially the lobbyist dealing with the money.
Correct.
Would there be any other reason to talk to you if not related to money?
We had discussed other issues. Rich Abramson had talked about the forestry issue. Certainly that was something I was communicating with the governor's office about. There's information that I provided in emails to suggest that I had been dealing with them on the forestry issue. But my main purpose with Good Will-Hinckley was funding.
And your assessment based on those conversations was that the funding was threatened, and it turns out your assessment was correct?
I believe so, yes.
Other questions? Yes, Senator Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to follow up on that for a moment. So the only two issues that you were dealing with on Good Will-Hinckley's behalf were funding related back several years. And more recently, because it's something the governor wanted to achieve, was lumber industry training.
Correct. I mean, there's been other, schedule requests to meet with him on other issues and commencement invitations and stuff, but from a legislative perspective, it was the funding issue, and then more recently, the forestry issue, which actually isn't even a legislative issue.
And so other than social niceties, events, triviality from a policy perspective, these were the two things.
Yes.
And would Good Will-Hinckley have considered it a threat of any kind should government decide not to pursue the lumber industry training that he wanted? Good Will-Hinckley, would that endanger Good Will-Hinckley in some way?
I suppose it could have, but that's not how I took it.
It was clear to you that of the things that you deal with, the reasons why they might have reached out to you, funding was the only one that would significantly impact Good Will-Hinckley. They wanted to have some influence over what Good Will-Hinckley did, express their discontent with the hiring. That's what they had to have been trying to get to.
Yes.
Thank you. Representative Mastracchio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have just two questions. Can you give us, tell us what kind of conversations you had with the acting commissioner discharge or communications, and did you have any doubts that did you think that he and Mr. Chadbourne were kind of operating on their own thing, or were they receiving direction from the Senate office?
So I actually don't believe that I had correspondence really with Commissioner Desjardins until later in the process, certainly not initially. In the conversations that we had, I think he characterized this morning, when he talked about the needing to find some money within the budget to cut, that Good Will-Hinckley would be a place that they could look. I hadn't had any conversations with him prior to June 5th about Good Will-Hinckley money perhaps being in jeopardy. I did have a conversation with Representative Jorgensen, who sits on the Appropriations Committee, who is also a member of the Good Will-Hinckley Board, that money is something that had been talked about, at least, whether or not that money should be there. I don't know if that was within his own caucus or in front of the entire AFA committee, but I had no conversations with Commissioner Desjardins prior to, I'd say probably close to the time the budget was actually finalized, which I think was voted on June 17th maybe. And I did send him an email, which I also provided on June 24th, just asking him if he had seen that the contract had been rescinded, and I did not receive a response on that. We've had subsequent meetings where he told me, after the payment was sent, that a memorandum of understanding or whatever one would call it with Good Will-Hinckley about the sort of strings that are attached to that money and how it could be used
I haven't seen that document, I don't know what it entails, but those conversations were after payments had been sent.
Did you ever that Mr. Chapman was operating on his own, just out of his own thoughts?
Yeah, I didn't get the sense that, he had, told me, oh, I had conversations with the governor, but I didn't get the sense that there was any, that he and Commissioner Desjardins had been corresponding or anything.
Is that- Further questions? Yes, Representative Duchesne and then Senator Dunn.
Yes, thank you. You get to sit through the whole morning, so you get to hear it all. Both Mr. Desjardins and Chadbourne maintain that they didn't actually make any threats when it came to money, and that, on the other hand, you seem to have received one. Is there anything in their remarks that differed from your recollection of the conversations?
Like I've said, there was no direct, the funding is in jeopardy. It was the sense that I got based on my, and I think Aaron is correct in that he was fairly new to this. He had only been there since February, where I have sort of a historical background of the last 4 years of working on this issue. But I stand by the fact that I believe that the characterization I've given is correct and that the funding was in jeopardy.
Further questions? I'm sorry, Senator Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, sir. Representative Duchesne just took my first questions. Yes. Did you ever meet with the governor, or get any correspondence from the governor, or be part of a meeting that you were at, and the governor attended, that this issue came up, and the governor made any comments about the school or what the threat or anything of that sort? No. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I'm just, yes, Representative McClellan, go ahead.
Use the microphone this time. Thank you, Mr. Chair. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Good. And you still work? You're still working with them?
I'm not under contract currently, but.
Just a real simple question, I guess. Maybe it'll be hard. I don't know. A little while ago, the word interference got bandied about for a few minutes, and part of my struggle with this whole situation is trying to compare it to everything else. Is this? So I guess my question to you is, do you perceive this was interference? Was this politics? Is this like a unique event that's never happened in Maine before? Or, I guess that's the dichotomy. Politics, unique, never happened in the history of Maine before. Can you comment on that?
I can't, I don't know, but I haven't been as closely involved with some of the things that may have happened in the past. I do believe that the governor felt that, taxpayer money was being used to support an organization that was hiring someone that he did not feel had supported charter schools, yet was going to be leading a charter school. And I guess my personal feelings on it are, the speaker was being hired because of his, I don't want to say political face, but essentially that's what it was, for who he is and what he was able to bring to the table. So I don't know that the governor making a political is any different than the school making a political in their hiring of the speaker for who he was and what he could bring to the table.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've just got a couple of other questions if I could. I want to direct your attention to the weekend of June 6th and 7th. Do you remember that? And I understand there were conversations you may have been involved in that weekend with Mr. Abramson and or Mr. Moore. Could you just tell us what you recall about those?
Sure. I had had some conversations with Aaron Chadbourne over the weekend about whether or not the governor would change his mind. And what I heard from Aaron was that the governor realized that people make mistakes and that people can change, particularly, or people can change their mind, particularly if the mistake is rectified. And I did relay that to Rich Abramson. I believe it was on Saturday the 6th, maybe Sunday the 7th. I don't believe that I spoke with Jack Moore until the first week, next week, sometime around the 8th or the 9th, and maybe even later.
Making a mistake referring to what in your mind?
Good Will-Hinckley making a mistake in their hiring.
And lastly, your impressions that you've given us here today, little bit in the vacuum at this point. Could you just tell us a little bit more about your experience and background in public policy matters?
Sure. I have worked for Maine State Solutions Bureau Dana since December of 2011. Prior to that, I served in the Senate Republican office from the beginning of the 125th legislature through December of 2011. I started as the administrative assistant in the office, worked into legislative aid, and left the office as chief of staff for the majority office. I've, seen power sharing arrangements and majorities move from one side of the aisle to the other, so I've kind of been here at a time where I've seen a lot of turnover and the different ways the legislature and the executive interact.
Seeing no other questions, did you bring all the documents or produce all the documents? Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. Next, Jay Nutting. Good afternoon. Please raise your right hand. You swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. If you could tell us who you are and what you do, and tell us anything else you'd like to before any questions come up.
Sure. My name is Jay Nutting. I'm employed by Main Street Solutions for Dana. I'm a resident of Abramson. I've been employed there for about 13 years now, and generally served as a government affairs consultant. I also, during this period of time, served on the Good Will-Hinckley board, which is an interesting situation. However, given that my firm does the lobbying work and I serve on the board, I would recuse myself from the board during that session. And because I serve on the board, I actually don't participate in the lobbying. No, I kind of step back.
So essentially, it had nothing to do with Good Will-Hinckley School during the period of these sessions. Is that essentially?
That's essentially it. For all intents and purposes, shut off my phone to Goodwill matters. So it's next to impossible to make it to board meetings, and I'm able to hear about what's going on through the grapevine, and I happen to open up some emails, but I do not participate in any of the meetings or as closely as I would during the summer.
So, in 2015, you took a leave of absence from the board beginning of January?
Yeah, essentially, December, January, when session starts picking up, either because I'm not able to make it to the board meeting, and then when session starts, I don't participate at all.
And you're back on the board now?
I am not, actually. I finished up earlier this summer, mid-summer. And that was just mainly because of the schedule. It didn't make sense for me to be on when I couldn't make it there a lot. It was better for them to have someone who could be there and participate. And I was brought on in the very beginning because there was a desire to have someone with some bit of agricultural background, it being an agricultural school. So I think they've managed to fill those gaps now through the means which didn't exist when I came.
Now, I know that on June 5th, you got a call from Ms. Vanderwood asking you if you would mark weeks in the retirement. I'll get to that in a second. Did you have any knowledge of this selection process and what was happening?
I did not.
When she called you to ask if the speaker had been hired, did you know the answer to that question?
I actually did not at that time. Embarrassingly enough, I sat outside of the couch next to the clerk's office and sorted through previous month's emails to find one that I had not opened that had the last two candidates' resumes included. And when I did open it and saw the speaker's name, I realized that what was being discussed on the third floor at that point was likely accurate.
What did you do with that information?
To the extent I could, not knowing 100%, I did confirm with Ms. Vanderwood that was likely the case because he was one of the finalists. So the information that was being discussed that morning was likely accurate.
And following that, your conversation with her, what other involvement have you had with this matter?
Not a whole lot really. Just, reading, watching from the outside. I did later on that morning. I did find the speaker's chief of staff just to check in to see if they were knowledgeable. But I figured they were, given how quickly news spreads on the small microcaps, and that is the third floor. But I don't believe she was aware of it when I told her that there were. That the governor had conveyed to various folks that he was displeased with the hiring.
Anything else following that?
Not that I can recall.
Have you produced any documents that were appropriate in response to the request?
I do not after searching. Just I don't have them. To your previous question, I did talk to Jack Moore. A couple short phone conversations. Those few days afterwards, just what I would consider kind of picking my brain conversations that I think he was having with a lot of people about what we do, what's happened, what the options. But that's the kind of the extent after the situation.
Thank you. Other questions for Mr. Lane? Senator Diamond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just quickly, how does one get on the board of Good Will?
In my situation, it led back to when Glenn Cummings started there. And I, of course, we worked with Glenn here in the State House, and he and some folks had known, my upbringing and background in agriculture. It's being brought up on a dairy farm and still involved in 4-H and things like that. And I think as they were putting together the board, they realized that they would like someone with some of that knowledge on there, because the board to that extent did not have anyone on there with agricultural experience. So at that point, Glenn had reached out and asked about interested in serving.
Excuse me, so you think that's how board members are created? Somebody reaches out and invites them to be on the board? Is that what happens? Is there a voting process after that?
There is a voting process generally. That's been my.
But you think they're most of the invitations by whomever to come to the board?
Yes, I also serve on another statewide agricultural youth board, and that's how that's done as well. I mean, we kind of look and see. We like to have a broad mix of people with experience statewide, locally, and what their backgrounds are, I mean, politically and not, connections and knowledge, and we try to have a well-rounded board. If I was asked at a board meeting a couple of weeks ago on another board I served, we had 2 vacancies, and we were all asked if we had any good ideas of candidates.
Of the board members when you were serving, how many of those board members had legislative connections?
Two.
You and Mr. Brown?
No, at that point it was Doug Carr and Bob Tardy. Both from the Good Will-Hinckley board.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Further questions? Senator Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up on what Senator Diamond said. Are you saying there's no central authority that appoints people to the board?
Oh, no.
I'm confused as to how,
right, the
your
board,
answer on how people get selected to this board.
Sure, and perhaps I'm not the best person to answer it either, but my understanding is, and my experience has been that there's the board chair or someone within the administration or leadership of a school or board, what have you, would, after being suggested or recommended, would reach out to you, check and see if you were interested in serving on the board, and then there would, I guess, be a vetting process where your resume or experience would be shared with the board, and then the board would vote to accept you as a board member.
If it's the chair of the board, the board itself picks its own members, is that what happens here?
I can't speak for every board, but that was my experience with this particular.
So it's not a gubernatorial appointment or?
No.
It's a public school district that has someone who is president or something?
Correct, it was not that.
It's not.
Senator. Other questions for Mr. Knight? Representative Mastraki.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Knight, with your experience on the board, and you did participate in this process, I'm assuming that you've read the okay review and its characterization as the hiring process being thorough, above board, and follow the process and follow the peer review from the assistant, and how they really work, or that you would agree with
I wouldn't agree with what was conveyed there. I haven't heard anything, even though I didn't participate, I haven't heard anything that lead me to believe that they, took a long, 6-month period of time with a typical standard for the search situation.
Thank you. Representative Campbell.
Thank you. You mentioned a little bit ago that Mr. Moore had a conversation with you, or you with him. Can you share with us about the timing of that? Was it during the process, or at what point did that?
You mean during the hiring process? No, the conversations we had were post the issue being in the news and throughout the State House. So it was after kind of everything that broke, all the news that broke. And the discussion really stemmed around, what's your recommendation? Do we have any other options? What is the best? It was basically, I offered to talk things through with him if he wanted. We didn't talk a lot, but I just wanted to, as a board member, to say if we wanted to bounce anything off of me. So we didn't do that.
So you were a board member at the time of the selection process, but
Correct.
then there was no one that reached out to you knowing how close you got to this process that might be a little concerned between the personalities and positions and the experience?
No one reached out to me at that point. Again, I would put that more on as my own fault, given that I was in some of the email chains and just plainly and embarrassingly did not pay attention or really open. One could assume that representative at this point.
Thank you. Other questions for Mr. Knight? Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since you're in a rather interesting position, you're familiar with the board, but you weren't part of the process. Interested in the thoughts. Are you accustomed to decisions of the board or decisions of any school systems you've been involved with, vetting their hiring decisions with chief executive?
I am not.
Thank you. Other questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for being here this afternoon. And I did ask you to produce any documents you have with you. Thank you very much. Our next invitee is Bill Brown. Brown? Good afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon.
Is there any help, please? You swear the testimony about the deal is the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Good afternoon. Would you tell us who you are and make any statement you'd like to as we begin?
Certainly. Just real briefly, I'd like to say that my name is Bill Brown. I have the honor and the privilege of having served 7 speakers of the House, working on as many biennial budgets and uncounted emergency budgets as well, to provide members, the public, and members of the media with accurate information in a timely fashion. I also have the privilege to serve as the board chair of the Maine Academy of Natural Sciences Board, not the board of Good Will-Hinckley. And I have also the distinct pleasure of being the constituent of Senator Davis.
Congratulations.
How's that working out?
It's been great so far.
I won't ask you how you voted. Questions for, anything else you'd like to say?
No, sir.
Questions for Mr. Brown? let me ask you this, so you were on the Means Board, I guess the chair of the Means Board, is that correct?
Yes, I became chair of the Means Board upon Rich Abramson becoming interim president.
That was approximately when?
Fall of 2014.
So would you tell us what role, if any, you played in the recruitment or application process for the new president of Good Will-Hinckley?
Sure, I was a member of the search committee, and at the urging of the former president, I mentioned the opening to the speaker.
And after that?
After that, I participated in I reviewed the 19 resumes. I participated in phone interviews for candidates that were selected, not including the speaker. I recused myself from that meeting, and at other points during any other point during the process where the board or the committee, the search committee, was considering his candidacy, recused myself.
At a certain point, he became one of the 6 finalists, is that true?
Yes.
What role, so he was involved in the process as one of the final 6 at that point. What role, if any, did you play from that point forward?
I offered no comment on his candidacy. If I was asked a question, I tried to respond truthfully to that question, but only offered it as information.
Did you participate in the vetting and discussing of the other 5 candidates?
I did, yes.
Well, this is by its very nature a comparative process, isn't it?
It is, yes.
How could you participate in talking about the other 5 without leaving one person out? How is that fair to the other 5 or to the speaker?
I'm not sure what I can say regarding the
Let
selection
me
process.
ask it a different way. And I go, hindsight is wonderful, but why didn't you just take yourself out of the process entirely once the speaker became one of the finalists?
It was my intention to make sure that the Means Board was represented in its advisory role through this process.
Why didn't you suggest that someone else from the Means Board take your spot?
I can't say why I didn't do that. It didn't occur to me at the time.
Other questions from Mr. Brown? Representative Campbell?
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Can you explain a little bit of the history? You mentioned something about serving 7 speakers. I was involved with Glenn Hinckley with respect to what's come of the boards and its mission. How were you first involved with Hinckley and then with the legislature with Hinckley?
Certainly. Thank you for the question. Beginning in 1999, began work for the legislature. In 2011, I left the legislature briefly for a year and a half, and I worked as vice president of operations for Good Will-Hinckley, at which time I assisted with the sale of a portion of the campus to the Maine Community College system, which you highlighted earlier today, and with the drafting, filing of the application to the Maine State Charter Commission to form the Maine Academy of Natural Sciences as a charter school after a year of operation as a private school, and then with the initial opening and operation of the Maine Academy of Natural Sciences as a public charter school. And I'm sorry, to finish that, when, I think in 2012, December of 2012, I returned to the legislature. Thank you.
Mr. Brown, could you tell us, at some point, Jack Moore raised the issue of doing another round of interviews with the top 2 candidates, and that's the speaker and whoever the other one was, right?
Yes.
How did you feel about that, and how did other members of the Means Board feel about that? Because this was a deviation from the initial selection process.
I felt it was a deviation from the process, but since there were questions for each of those two candidates that could be resolved before the full boards met with them. As long as the Maine Academy of Natural Sciences Board was present in some way, I felt that that would be acceptable.
So there were two, you did express some concern about it, did you not?
I don't know if though I expressed concern.
And those two interviews took place in Brunswick on May 13th, is that right?
That's correct.
I take it they were two separate
Yes.
meetings? And
Exactly.
who was at each of those meetings?
Chair Moore, myself, each of the chief candidates, and Vice President, or I guess acting president at that point, Rob Moody.
So you participated in the meeting that involved the speaker?
I was there. I wouldn't say I participated. I strove to find another member of my board to attend, but they were unable to.
Recall if you participated in the meeting?
Pardon me?
Do you recall if you participated in the meeting?
I was present. I did not ask any questions. I didn't answer any questions. I was there in an observer role.
Is it fair to say that following those two meetings that there was some discussion among the Good Will-Hinckley people about how each of those meetings had gone?
Yes, though I think discussion is strong of a word. I think there was a sense that one candidate's answers, but again, this was not my judgment. I think there was a sense that one candidate's answers were more complete or more reassuring than others.
Well, the meetings took place separately with an hour in between them, so some separation.
Yes, but I probably not that much, but yes.
The second meeting ends.
Yes.
By candidate number 2, 4 of you or 3 of you are still there, correct?
Yes.
Had some discussion about what had taken place?
Yes.
Did you participate in that discussion?
No.
Were you present for the
I
discussion?
was present for the discussion again and in an observer role.
You said nothing.
I don't recall saying anything substantive.
Thank you. Other questions, Mr. Brown? Senator Dunn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Brown.
Good afternoon, Senator.
You acted like you had more you wanted to say about, the question was asked about those 6 interviews. You had participated in 5 of those. And it is a comparative sort of a situation. What did you do with the information that you garnered from your interview process when that was then put together with the other candidate, all 6? Did I explain that well?
Well, let me provide an answer, and if that answer doesn't speak to your question, frankly, we can clarify that. At the end of the process, I returned all the materials for the search process to human resource staff at Good Will-Hinckley.
All the interviews you did, all the data you gathered, you then gave that to another person, human resources folks?
Yes.
And then they included that in their discussion with the final candidate you did not interview?
No, I'm sorry. This was at the conclusion of the process. I returned all my documents. Without getting too deep into the particulars of the process, I looked at how I felt the candidates whom I had heard speak had responded to the different criteria that we considered. And I advocated for their inclusion.
Okay. So you evaluated 5 of them that you talked to in your own evaluation?
Yes.
And then your evaluations were put with whoever interviewed the 6, the speaker?
Yes.
That was under consideration?
Yes.
Representative Kruger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Brown, for coming.
Thank you, Chair.
I know you to be a very careful, very thoughtful, and dare I say, intelligent person. And we have all encountered over the years inadvertent conflict situations, and we handle them the best we can. At any time during the process of selection, do you think you maintained your personal highest standard for staying out of the position of conflict in this particular appointment? I mean, it wasn't something you designed. So it came upon you, you're chairman of the board, you need to have Maine's input there. Are you comfortable with how you handled the potential conflict or the perceived conflict?
In hindsight, I wish I had absented myself from the process entirely. But given the timing and the circumstances, I would give a qualified yes. Thank you.
Senator Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Senator.
Being here today. You said in the opening, you had 7 speakers in the House of Representatives.
Yes, sir.
That's 7, 6 presidents in the Maine Senate, so you're ahead. I'm curious, the previous person that testified spoke about the manner in which board members are selected. I'm curious if you could shed some light if you have on the board, that perhaps you can tell us how that all comes about.
Well, I can attempt to speak to the different processes that each separate board uses to select, vet, and elect members. In my understanding of how Good Will-Hinckley chooses its board members is there are candidates that are put forward and are then considered by a membership organization known as the Good Will Home Association, which alumni and other interested folks who then in their annual meeting vote on to accept or reject different board members to serve on the Good Will-Hinckley board.
So the board itself doesn't select its own membership, it's vetted through a committee of sorts?
Yes.
And the alumni vote on it?
Alumni and others.
Is that how you became a member?
No, I am not a member of the Good Will-Hinckley board. I am a member of the Maine Academy of Natural Sciences board, whose members are selected both by members of the Good Will-Hinckley board and by members of the Maine Academy of Natural Sciences board.
How long have you been on board?
I want to say since summer.
6 speakers ago?
Not quite that soon, Senator. I want to say summer of 2014 perhaps. Sorry. I served as a board member for some period of time before assuming chairmanship.
Thank you for that answer. I don't want to be crass, but this hindsight's perfect. It leads you to a very perfect place. Unfortunately, we can't do it. I understand, saying we would do things differently in regards to all of this. I can assure you that if I had my time to move, we would do things differently. And that's probably what we'd talking to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Other questions for Mr. Brown? Senator Burns.
Afternoon, Mr. Brown.
Good afternoon, Senator.
Just a couple of questions if I can. How were you selected as the chair of the Maine's board? Is that through the vote of the board?
I believe it was, yes. That was, yes, to the best of my recollection.
How long have you been chair?
As I said a few moments ago, I believe I've been chair since, I want to say fall of 2014.
2014. Forgive me if I asked the
No,
question
not at all.
that's already been asked. A couple of us fall asleep here. Can you explain a little bit more to me about what you mean when you say you recuse yourself? You've probably explained this 3 times now, but out of the 5 candidates that you participated in, that was not a recusal, that was taking full time, is that correct?
Yes, I listened to their answers, and I don't believe I asked them any questions, but I listened to their interviews.
Okay, so did the rest of the participants in that process ask questions?
I would say certainly some, but I couldn't speak to exactly who or how many.
So some did set out and ask any questions to your recollection?
I'm sorry, Senator, this was several months ago, and
Did you purposely not ask any questions, or just didn't give? Well, we're already answering one.
I think I found my questions were answered, so, excuse me, were answered.
Okay. So when you say recuse yourself from the speakers part of this, what does that mean to you? How did you recuse yourself? You just said you wanted to?
No, for the speaker's phone interview, I was not present.
Okay. What about his board interview?
His board interview, I opened the meeting and observed as other members asked him questions.
Okay. And you didn't participate at all in that particular aspect?
I don't know.
No, you didn't?
No.
Question about Good Will-Hinckley, you know, they had a development director or fundraising director,
They have.
other than the president.
I would say back prior to 2008, Good Will-Hinckley had a development department. And since that time, they've not had a development director. They have employed a development associate.
If it works, probably, and along with the president?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. As far as the Goodwill Board is concerned, did you participate in any outside of board discussion with them about these candidates?
Yes.
None?
No.
Did you at any point give any feedback to the speaker about any of these deliberations that were taking place in front of your presence?
No.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, Senator. Other questions for Mr. Brown? Representative Campbell?
Thank you. Mr. Brown, you go back several speakers, so you must go back three governors.
Second.
And I think we all kind of agree that this governor is a different personality. Knowing what you know about the system and the fact that you are more around the board than Mr. Nutting, I'm assuming that you must have had some discussions about with other board members. Did you talk to other board members about the process at all outside of deliberations?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm
Well,
sorry.
generally, we all know each other as board. When it comes time to vote on something that has a conflict, you recuse yourself. But in many cases, knowing other people, we have discussions outside the boardroom or the vote. Did you have any discussions with other members of the boards, either board?
I had
Process?
I had a conversation with one member that consisted of, we have some interesting candidates. I was asked by another member what I thought of the relationship between the governor and the speaker. And I believe my words were, it's better than it was last session, and it's as good as anyone else's. And at the time it was.
So I guess, knowing what you know about the system for 7 speakers, and the environment for which we're now in, I asked both Mr. Moore and Mr. Abramson about the fact that I asked them if there was any dialogue concerning the speaker's past support or not, and his general fundraising in areas not quite as related to charter school. I'm confused where you, Mr. Nutting, many others, Mr. Tardy, others who have been on the board and know what might happen in an environment like this, which is different than probably ever before. There was never any dialogue amongst the members at the board through the deliberations or outside about the possibility that this might not be a good fit. Can you explain why that didn't happen?
I'm sorry, can you repeat your question? There's going to be several pieces to it. I want to make sure I answer it
I guess
completely.
it's just the point, knowing the environment, the present environment since January, and the fact that this selection seemed to have occurred then. I find it unusual that there was no one that was talking about this or really actually had a discussion concerning the environment and the credentials for the finalists.
I would,
I think there were discussions, along these lines, but in any event,
Yeah, I guess, I asked Mr. Moore the same thing.
Sure.
And no one really talked about it. Basically, the position was, we're nonpartisan, we're not political, but wow, look at where we are now.
I guess I would say again that, in my view, my taking temperature, until this situation, relations between the third and the second floor seem to be as good as they had been at any point in the past.
You were well aware of how much the government did support the school and how excited he was about it until this point?
Certainly, I was present at the graduation in which the commencement at which he spoke. As I said, I worked on preparing and submitting the application for the Maine Academy of Natural Sciences to become a public charter school, and helped with the operation of that.
Thank you. Thank you. Other questions? Senator Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You were on the board when Speaker Cummings was selected?
No, sir. I worked. I was an employee of Good Will-Hinckley after now President Cummings was then President Cummings.
So you didn't have any disputes?
I did not, no.
Other questions? Senator Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. I thought I was all done, but I think I heard Representative Campbell ask you the exact same question that I tried to ask you, whether or not you had any discussions, informal discussions with any of the board members outside of the board meetings. And I thought you told me distinctly you had not. I just heard 2 or 3 different conversations related. So can you clarify that? Did you have those discussions outside of the board meeting?
I'm sorry, it was not my intention to mislead
No, I'm
you.
sure it wasn't. I'm trying to clarify this in my own mind, what recusal really means. So these are the things you have discussions with some of the board members that were participating in the hiring process.
As I said, I had one conversation with a board member, and with the extent to which was, well, we certainly have some interesting candidates. Yes. And the other was, I was asked for my opinion of the relationship between the speaker and the governor. And I provided, as I said, that I was better than the previous session and as good as anyone else's. Or appeared to be.
Who were those discussions with?
The first was with Gov't, and to the best of my recollection, the second was with Jack Moore.
Thank you very much.
Certainly.
Other questions? Yes, Representative Stracchio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Brown, can you just tell me as a board member of Maine's, what role does the department head or other functions of state government actually participate in hiring decisions that you would have been in the school or would have been
The State Charter Commission is notified of any changes in leadership.
so the Department of Ed doesn't participate in the Commissioner of Education, the governor's office, none of those people participate?
No, ma'am.
Other questions for, yes, Representative Campbell.
Were you involved with 5 of the 6? And I'm sure you knew the speaker's resume pretty well. Did the others have different types of experience? One more education? What were the experiences or resumes of the others?
I would say that all of the candidates brought some qualities to the table. None brought all of the qualities to the table. Is that helpful?
Pretty much.
Okay.
Other questions? Representative Sanderson?
Thank you. I came in late, so please pardon me if I ask a question that has already been asked, and I apologize. I had an appointment at my daughter's school I could not get out of. But just out of curiosity, well, not out of curiosity, but it was told to us at the last meeting, you were the gentleman who informed Speaker Eaves of the position, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. When did you inform him of that?
Without looking at the documents, I can't give you a date, but I can tell you that I informed him of the position when former president of Good Will-Hinckley and current president of the University of Southern Maine mentioned to me that the position might be of interest to Mark.
Okay. And I came in, it was, I wish I didn't get there early, I'm so sorry. Did you provide Speaker Eaves at any time about information regarding any of the other candidates?
No.
No? Okay. Did you give the speaker any advice or tips during the interview process?
I did. I looked at his resume and noted to him certain aspects that I thought that aspects of his resume and experience that I felt the school, in searching for an outward-facing leader, would be interested in, and that those, if you were to highlight perhaps those areas, that would be helpful.
Okay. Did you provide that as a member of the Means board? Did you provide that same kind of advice to any of the other candidates?
I was not asked.
Speaker Eaves asked you for advice or tips?
Again, I would have to look at documents I've provided to this committee, but I recall that I saw his resume and made those comments.
Okay. Speaker Eaves does not have any education, is correct?
I think that's I would not say I would not characterize it that way, but the speaker has worked in school systems with at-risk youth.
Did you draft Good Will-Hinckley's announcement about the hiring of Speaker Eaves?
I did not.
Do you know who did?
I believe it was staff at Good Will-Hinckley.
One of the big questions that I have is, it was very hard for this committee when we had to wait to get a copy of the Alphon letter that was sent to Good Will-Hinckley, and it was obviously in the press prior to anybody having seen the letter. And the press evidently had a copy. Do you know where the press received a copy of the letter from?
I do not.
Did you submit it to them?
I did not.
Did the board?
I do not know who. I do not know how the press got hold of that letter.
Thank you.
Certainly.
Other questions? Senator Guzowski?
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Brown. I have kind of a direct question. I like those, and you do too. And I think that you've been around this building longer than most, and you've probably been more involved in the budget process than most over the years you've been here. I also think that most anybody that's ever worked in the House has asked you for advice once or twice. And I have. We're investigating, we're trying to come to some sort of a conclusion about certain facts that deal with this issue of the governor, Good Will-Hinckley, and Speaker Eaves. You've seen how budgets have been manipulated over the years. You've seen how sometimes good intentions have gone sour. You've seen how politics has been played out on the second and third floor. I believe you've served under three different administrations, one being an independent, one being a Republican, one being a Democrat. My question is, are we in the world of bare knuckle, hardball politics, or something else?
I'm unsure how to answer that question.
I'm not sure of how to ask that question, but I think it's the question that we're all asking. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions. Representative Mastracchio. And again, I think these questions are all fair game, but I don't want to lose the committee's focus about the,
And that was going to be my point, is that for me, it's about, was the board decided to hire the speaker, and that vote was,
Let me clarify, the Good Will-Hinckley board voted unanimously
unanimous.
to hire the speaker.
So it wasn't like you had the vote that pushed it over the edge, and it was close, or that you were even on that board that voted.
Correct.
other questions, Mr. Brown? Representative Sanderson and then Representative Campbell.
What role did you play in discussing with the board, or did the board have conversations, both boards, both the Good Will-Hinckley board and the Means board, about the need for certain qualifications? And I'm referring to the initial announcement that went out when first seeking a president for the school. There was a very long list and detailed set of criteria for what the board was looking for in a president for the school. And somehow through the process.
Object.
Sir?
I don't feel that the question before us or these proceedings have anything to do with the qualifications of the candidates for president of Good Will-Hinckley. This is about the process and about the possible threat made of withdrawing funding. It is not about Marquis or anyone else's qualifications to serve in that job.
May I respond to that, Mr. Chairman?
Sure.
I think it's very relevant to that. We obviously have an executive who was incredibly upset about the hiring of an individual who he feels does not qualify for the job of president of Good Will-Hinckley.
This is not.
The initial job description that was put out was incredibly detailed, looked for a depth of knowledge in education, superintendent experience, curriculum experience. It's all in the report. It's very detailed. Yet what happened, what came out of the other end was someone who was forward-facing and good at fundraising. That's a very different set of criteria from what went in the front door and what came out the back door at the end of the deal. So I think it's very important to try and understand the thought process of the board in selecting Speaker Eves for this position when he doesn't have the qualifications that were initially posted for that position.
Representative Kruger.
I just don't feel that this is an appropriate line of questioning for this proceeding. It's just not about the candidate's qualifications. It's not about the decision by the board of who to hire and how. We're way off topic, and I would like this committee to get back onto the topic.
All right. So here's, I think, what we're going to do. It's 3:20. We want to get this wrapped up this afternoon. I think that Representative Kruger is correct in reciting the scope of our work here on this committee. I think there's been a good vetting of the process that the board has gone through. But I would agree that the wisdom of the board's decision in selecting the speaker, or the lack of wisdom of the board in selecting the speaker, is not what we're here to do. So I would ask committee members to attempt to restrict their questions to the scope of the review that we agreed upon.
May I make one comment, Mr. Chair?
You could make a motion to overrule my ruling.
I move to overrule the rule.
Second.
Moved and seconded to overrule my ruling. Is there discussion on the motion? Senator Burns.
Thanks, Senator. Let's see if I can be succinct about this. This never happened. Try. I heard a phrase today that really put this in context. Somebody mentioned that this is about politics to some extent on both sides. We're talking about the administration, we're talking about the board's process. Our focus has been to determine what happened and maybe why it happened. So if you're going to answer those two questions, you have to go a little bit further than just one side of the equation. I think that's the effort that's undergoing right now. So if you cut the discussion off at only one side of the discussion, one side of the equation, you're never going to know why something took place. We've been talking about why the board did what it did. It's coming into perspective to me, I think, why the administration did what he did. So I think to try to, at this point, narrow the focus down to one side of the equation is I think these questions are in line. Otherwise we're only talking about one side of the equation. Thank you.
Further discussion on the motion, Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The question that we're trying to answer with PEGA's work and these follow-on interviews is the question of what happened regarding the providing and withholding and the communications regarding Good Will-Hinckley funding as requested by representatives that sent this committee a letter, and senators as well. And it's very clear, it's been made clear multiple times during the course of our questions and answers offered, that the chief executive was not pleased and felt he had a long list of reasons why he was not pleased with that outcome of that selection process. We've also had questions asked.
Excuse me, Senator, could you just direct your comments specifically to the motion before us?
Certainly. The line of inquiry that you have ruled, I believe, accurately, is not part of our question, is not part of that question. How the chief executive feels about that was not the subject of our inquiry. The actions regarding funding were. So I would support this.
Further discussion on the motion? Senator, Representative Bashane and Senator Davis.
Thank you, Senator. We have multiple mics on. Thank you, Senator. Yeah, I guess my understanding of the charge is we're essentially going to get a final report out of OPEGA, which we're going to have to vote to endorse, and it's going to be fact-finding. So we're really concerned about the what. We really don't care that much about the why. Other people later can figure out all the whys they want. I may be overruled by... But anyway, I don't think we're that concerned about the why. I think we want to know the what's, and then endorse the report or not. That's what we're doing.
Thank you. Senator Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would support what Senator Burns has said. Any good investigator, any investigation that's done, you look at the whole thing to find the facts as to the whole situation. And I think leaving out the questions that have been put forth here isn't wrong. There have been numerous times today when I thought the questions that were being asked shouldn't be asked. There have been times, Mr. Chairman, when I thought that you should have stopped the question. But that's my point. I think that the question should go forward as they've been presented. Thank you.
Thank you. Further discussion? Representative Campbell and then Representative Sanderson.
Thank you. I guess I agree with the premise that our mission is the what and not the why. But in fact, the what becomes two-sided. And if I don't know the other side, the what happened as a result of what happened isn't going to be clear to me. So I'm still asking a few questions about how the what happened, and then the what which reacted to what's happening happened.
Thank you. Representative Sanderson.
Thank you. I agree that we are here talking about the funding regarding the Good Will-Hinckley School and what has happened or what may or may not have happened. However, when you're trying to build a report for which to make a basis, you have to have a solid foundation. We've talked about process in here several times throughout the course of our hearings and our meetings on the subject. We even talked about it today with Mr. Chadwick from the governor's office. And I think it's only appropriate now when we have Mr. Brown in front of us, who is a member of the Means board, and can give us an indication on the board's thoughts on the process, is equally as important as questioning someone from the governor's office or any other entity. Which is why I would hope that my colleagues on this committee would allow us to agree to vote in favor of my motion to overrule the ruling and continue.
Thank you. Further discussion? The only other thing I would say is to look at the language of our charge, which is that on July 1, this committee directed OPECA to determine the facts associated with alleged proposed changes to the state's fiscal year 2016 and 2017 Department of Education funding for Good Will-Hinckley and the impact of those proposed changes to the school. The charge might have also been to look into the wisdom or lack thereof of the hiring decision, but that is not in our charge, and that's why I do what I have. Before we vote, let me ask if I could a question of our Deputy Attorney General. Whether I get to vote on the motion?
Any questions for me?
Do I get to vote on? That's okay. Do I get to vote on the motion? So the motion is to essentially to allow Representative Sanderson and others to continue the line of questioning she was beginning to do. And all in favor of that motion, please indicate by raising your hand. No, you can't vote. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Am I right? And those opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it was 6 to 5, and I think it was. I'm going to choose not to vote in those circumstances. It's 6 to 5, and the motion will fail. Anyway. So, Representative Sanderson, please continue the questions with the ruling in mind.
I have no further questions at this time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Other questions of Mr. Brown? Seeing none, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you all.
And our next invitee is Greg Powell. Good afternoon. How are you? Please raise your hand, please. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give will be true, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I know you've not been here the entire day, but we're pleased to have you here. If you could identify yourself, tell us what you do, and make any comments you'd like to make at the beginning.
Thank you. My name is Greg Powell. I am the chairman of the board of trustees of the Harold Alphon Foundation. I'm also chief executive officer of Dexter Enterprises. And I have no opening statement.
Questions for Mr. Powell? Representative? Representative Sampson.
Welcome, Mr. Powell. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
I read your letter that you sent to the Hinckley board. In that letter, it expressed concern about sending, about funding or the possibility of using state funding. And it asked to have the opportunity to come up and reassess Good Will-Hinckley's finances. Is that correct? In terms of the grant?
Yes, I think you're correctly characterized the sum of the letter.
Thank you. In that letter, did you say that we will be removing funding?
I did not, and it was never our intention to send such a message to Good Will-Hinckley.
Thank you.
Other questions? Let me ask you, if I could. On June 5th, it's my understanding you were actually out of state, but got 2 voicemails. Do you recall that?
They were messages to my office, so I did not get a voicemail, but I was on my way to Arizona in the air.
And the requests were to call Mr. Moore and to call the governor?
That's correct.
And you did call Mr. Moore on, I think it was June 7th. Does that sound right to you?
Over that weekend I did. I believe it was the 7th. It could have been the 6th.
Could you tell us what you recall about that conversation?
Well, what I did was I exchanged calls with him, and we left voicemails for each other. I am not confident that we actually had a two-way conversation.
Did you speak with him sometime in the immediate future after that?
I did, and I believe over the course of that weekend, in exchanging messages where we spoke, that I understood something of the nature of the controversy that was brewing. So that was my first indication, really, that there had been a controversy brewing about the appointment of the speaker and the governor's dissatisfaction with that appointment.
And I think you did actually speak with the governor on the 8th, Sunday, is that?
No, the 8th was actually a Monday, and I returned his call on Monday afternoon on my way to Boston, and either he called me right back or whatnot.
Tell us what you recall about that conversation, please.
Yes, we exchanged pleasantries. He told me that he was calling because he understood that Good Will-Hinckley had appointed Speaker Mark Eves to be its next president, that he regretted very much that this had been done, and he regretted that he would no longer be able to support the school. He gave me several reasons for why he could no longer support the school. He said something to the effect that in good conscience as the governor of the state, that he did not feel he could support an institution that would be led by a person who had been opposed to charter schools, who had ran a charter school. That person who lived so far away from the school, he felt might not be in a good position to run the school. He felt that the political nature of the speaker's connection with the legislature was not a good thing, and he also felt that the speaker did not have the credentials that were required for a school of this type, referring to the current president, Abramson, and the prior president, Glenn Cummings, as being very, very well qualified, and the speaker not being so well qualified. Those were his points.
Was there any discussion in that conversation about whether there would be continued state funding or not?
No. He told me that he could not support the school, and he was, in a sense, expressing his regret because we had worked together to help the school, and he had been a strong supporter, and I think he felt that he should tell me of his position and his what he was going to do.
The word support, is that a word you think he used, or is that your...
No, he used the word support because I understood his support to be moral, public, and being an active promoter of funding. So I was not smart enough at the time to question him in detail about what he meant by support, but I certainly was concerned after the call that part of that support would involve funding.
Now, as that relates to the continued financial support of the Harold Alfond Foundation, within a period of time, did you start to become concerned that if the state funding were lost, that this might impact on what the position of the foundation might be going forward?
I was very concerned because this was deja vu all over again. As some of you may remember, in 2008, the school went into insolvency. And this was largely a result of a shift in state funding away from residential education to a system where foster care was being used for kids that needed, help and a better place to learn and to live. And so our funds that we had in the endowment and otherwise became at risk as the school went into insolvency. And so the school's resurrection from the 2008 insolvency and its climb back to its current state today of doing really good things for Maine kids was very, very much a concern for us. So when I was thinking about saying, what's going to happen with state funding, it was almost immediately on my mind that this was a risk.
You recall, I think you met with Mr. Moore about June 15th and dinner perhaps?
I did. I did.
And did you discuss with him those concerns you just raised here this afternoon?
Absolutely.
And
what did he knew of them though, because I had asked Jack Moore to help out at Goodwill. He's a smart, very intelligent guy from a finance standpoint. And one of the things I wanted him to do was to try to work with the board and to bring people to the board to bring financial stability and sustainability to the operation.
so, did you discuss with Mr. Moore at dinner what you saw as perhaps a downward spiral if the state funding were not received?
I think he already knew, that this was a serious issue, and the more that people were thinking about it, the more concerned they became, because $500,000 a year, which is what we had sort of concluded was at risk here in the first year, was at least 15% of the operating budget of Goodwill as a total operation, perhaps as much as 20 if you just narrow down the Means Academy itself. It was a big chunk of money.
Could you just remind us, the Harold Alphorn Foundation had made, I guess commitment would be too strong a word, but an expectation that if certain performance measurements would be met, that there was going to be additional funding from the Harold Alphorn Foundation going into 2017, 2018. Can you do that for us?
Sure. Over the past 6 years or so, we have made grants to community college and Goodwill, and just a Goodwill part of I think the total lifetime is about well over $10 million. And so in 2014, we actually made a specific grant using a contractual agreement, which I shared with Beth, in which we agreed to help fund the construction of the Moody School, the expansion of the Moody School. The premise, the financial model being that in order for Goodwill to be sustainable in the future, it had to increase the number of students it served from the 60 and 70 range up to 210. That commitment was based on the school's proposal to us of meeting certain financial goals and aspirations. And there was a lot of conversation about that in the process of making the grant. And so the grant consisted of two parts. The whole grant was $5.5 million, and we advanced the first half of it right up front within a matter of months, sometime in 2014. The final slug of it was to be paid in 2019 or sooner, depending upon the school's progress in achieving its goals of increasing enrollment to 210 students. And all of our grant agreements, usually unless it's Easter seals or something, are in the form of agreements. We regard them as contracts. We expect our grantees to do their part. We expect them to live up to the business plan that they put for us.
So the concern, I take it, was that without the state funding, that perhaps they would not be able to reach those performance measures?
Yes. More importantly, we care deeply about this institution. Over 6,000 lives have been changed by what Good Will-Hinckley does. And if they got off track and they didn't continue to grow, and we've already spent $2.75 million to expand the Moody School so they could accommodate 210 students, I wanted to know what the plan was going to be.
do those concerns cause you to write Mr. Moore the letter dated June 18th that we have?
Yes.
And essentially, what message were you attempting to convey by that letter?
Well, I wanted Jack and his board to understand our concern. I wanted them to move forward in a way that would be as positive as possible for the institution. I wanted them to take it seriously, and we wanted to help. And for that reason, the second part of my letter was to tell them that we had engaged a consultant to come back in, look at the financial model, maybe still what are the options here to deal with the lack of funding, how could funding be replaced some other way, any and all were up for grabs, and to report back to me and my board as to what the plan was if $500,000 a year for the next couple of years was not going to be there.
And after you sent that letter, what other communications did you have with Mr. Moore or anyone else from the Hinckley board?
I think
about their plan.
I really didn't have a lot of contact with folks at Goodwill other than Jack Moore. He was the chairman of the board and he was reporting into me. But as far as Jack is concerned, he was keeping me up to date on what the deliberation process was, what considerations the board was undertaking to try to deal with the situation. And obviously I was reading the press.
Did Mr. Moore discuss with you the dilemma that they were in terms of whether to continue the relationship with the speaker?
He did. He advised me that there were a whole bunch of options that were being considered. Everything from getting the speaker and the governor together to try to resolve things, to having funding from another source, to how what would we operate the school and turn away kids that couldn't afford to pay for. I mean, all of the options were on the table. The progression was increasingly, I think, moved toward the question of whether the speaker would stay in his position. And I think one option was obviously that the speaker and he would agree that it would be better if he didn't move forward with employment and just to simply put the school's interests first. And so that was clearly part of the conversation as well. And he was reporting to me on how that process was going forward.
Mr. Moore told us that his impression after his conversations with you was that if the state funding wasn't received, that the Harold Alfon Foundation, $2.75 million that was still due, might be in some kind of jeopardy because of the reasons you stated this afternoon. Is that a fair conclusion?
I think it was a conservative, cautious conclusion that he recognized, as all our grantees do, or should, that if they don't meet their end of the bargain, okay, you can't expect us to step forward and fund. Having said that, because there's been a lot of misrepresentation about our position in the press, I want everyone to know that we want all our grantees to succeed, and we usually do everything we can to see that they succeed. And at no time did my board ever say, we're not going to give you the money, we're going to let you go down the hole or whatever. We were concerned about what is the plan? What is your plan to deal with this? And we expected, frankly, the state to do its part. I mean, these are people that can't afford to have the education that they need to prosper. And so the withdrawal of funding was not a good thing, and so we wanted to know what the plan was.
Beside the conversation you had with the governor on June 8th, did you have any other conversations with the governor on this topic?
No, I did not.
Or anybody else from the administration?
I did not.
Thank you, Mr. Powell. Other questions for Mr. Powell? Representative Stracchio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for coming, Mr. Powell. The conversation that you had with the governor, were you was it like when the governor did most of the talking, or did you respond to his concerns or answer any of them? Was it mostly just a listening kind of conversation?
That was mostly him talking.
And can Mr. Abramson characterize the conversation that he had with the governor as one in which the governor said some not very nice things about the speaker and kind of, went into the details of why you didn't like it or why you didn't wish to be in a position? Would you say it was the same kind of phone call that you had?
Well, he did not. I don't think he spoke disparagingly of the speaker, with the possible exception of describing his educational skills as being fiddle in a thimble. The term he used. So Other than that, he listed, reasons that I think have been probably rehashed in this committee a number of times.
So how did you respond to him?
Well, at this point, I was a little flat-footed. I had been visiting a friend who was basically in his last days dying of cancer, and so the perspective of things was a little different for me at that point. So I told him that, that the school was my first interest, and that I doubted very much if anyone at Goodwill was disrespectful or ungrateful for the support that he, and frankly, the legislature had extended to the school. And that I did not know anything about the hiring of Speaker Eves. I didn't know anything about the points that he was making about Speaker Eves. And so.
Did you make him any promises, I'll look into it, or thank you for calling, Governor, goodbye?
No, as a matter of fact, what he said to me was that the contract had been already signed. And it was like, so I'm calling you, Greg, because I'm just not going to support this. And I know how much money and time, Mr. Alphon and then his foundation had invested in the school. So it was kind of like, I regret what's happening here.
So what did you get out of that? I guess, what was the point of this phone call then? Because he's the only one from the administration that you spoke with. You're out here. I mean, I'm trying to connect what that has to do with the other, unless it is that whole domino effect. So I'm interested in your assessment of what the point of that phone call was.
I think that for me, the context was that for many years, since he's been in office, I had talked with him about the school. And I knew he was passionate about the school and wanted to see it succeed and to support it. And he was taking a position now that was pretty darn tough. And he was withdrawing his support. He wasn't really telling me what that meant in the call, but support from the state government has been an issue that our foundation's been familiar with for years, all right? So I was concerned, and I just felt as if it was a call that was personal as much as anything to say, we've been partnered in trying to help the school. I'm pulling out of the partnership for the reasons that I have stated.
So support equals money.
That's what I came to believe.
That's what I'm asking.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Morrow, for coming. Thank you for what the foundation does. Dexter, Harold, and Vivi, just wonderful asset for the community. Thank you so much. The thread of the day, from my perspective, is one of, we seem to be speaking in code. It appears that never once funding was mentioned from anybody's perspective. Yet, the impression that everybody got from the communications, or maybe even body language, was that funding was going to be withheld. But in fact, as we talked to Mr. Disjardin, it doesn't appear that it was in terms of sequence timeline or even the big picture. And then we heard out and about that you were withholding funding, but in fact, you didn't say that, and you didn't imply that, really. It's just, what's your business plan? How are we going to overcome this together? So, I don't know if there's a question in that, but what's your perspective on speaking in code?
I can't vouch for other folks. Like, all I can tell you is that it's very, very clear in my mind today. It's clear in my board, who have now been fully briefed on this or whatever, that we had never concluded that we were going to pull funding. We had never intended to communicate that. We hadn't even had a meeting to talk about the circumstance, to decide what we were going to do. But one thing my board does expect of me is to know the facts. And I got to know if the funding's not going to be there, what's the plan, and I don't want to wait until they're already dead to ask them how to, one resurrection's enough, all right? We had that in 2009, so we didn't want to see it happen again. So.
Thank you. Representative Sanderson.
Thank you.
The Alphone Foundation has been working in a partnership, if you will, you and me and the governor, on the Good Will-Hinckley School since the 125th, since he was first elected in Brett, trying to resurrect the school.
And with you folks, I mean,
Yes.
you've been a part of it. You've voted for appropriations for which we're very grateful, so thank you for your partnership.
You're very welcome. So.
I hope it continues.
Quite frankly, so do I. And it is no secret, the governor has been a huge supporter of this school. And I just wanted to clarify that support in this case does not just mean funding, as you stated. You when you initially spoke to the governor, did you mean to say, and this is how I took it, I just want to clarify that the support was for the actual school itself, the goal of the school, and if they were going, which he's always been a huge, wrapped his arms around it and been a huge advocate for, that he was just not going to do that anymore, not just funding.
I think what the governor was thinking, I don't know. All I can tell you is what he said.
What was your impression?
What he said to me is, I can't, in good conscience, as governor of this state, continue to support a school where the CEO is a opponent of charter schools, lives a long way away from the town, and is not, in his opinion, qualified. I have no way of knowing whether Speaker Eves was qualified or not. I had no idea that he had been picked until I think I got a voicemail from Jack Moore over that weekend saying that that's what they'd done, and the governor was unhappy. So, am I answering your question?
Yeah, you are. In respect to the financial stability of the school, when the school applied for your grant, were you aware of the 2-year plan that they had submitted the year prior to essentially put off the state funds?
I was aware of a couple of things. First, we made a grant of, I think it was about $10.2 million to Goodwill and to the community college in 2011. And at that time, state funding was also part of the picture, and it was for the residential part of the program. And in that grant agreement, one of the requirements for Goodwill was to continue to have that government funding for residential programming. It was absolutely critical to the school. The school's history, for these of you who don't know, is it was a home first, okay? And it was an education home. So the concept of having statewide reach, kids from all over the state come to Goodwill, and when they come from Kittery, they got to have a place to live. So back in 2011, I think that's when it was, when we made that grant agreement, we explicitly stated that, the residential funding was part of the picture, and that was something that Glenn had worked on, and since then, other CEOs of the school have worked on. So by the time we get to the next grant, where we're moving school, it was part of the picture, it was part of the funding, the revenue stream for the school, and we expected it to continue for a couple more years, and now to your point, with the understanding that it would be weaned off at some point in time. And I think the idea was that with this latest budget, that was going to be the next couple of years of it, and then hopefully they'd have a plan to replace it with outside funding.
So in clarification, the first funding was the initial $750,000 per year that the governor proposed for supporting, but it got whittled down to 300 and some odd thousand.
That was back in the 2011, 12, 13 period, right?
And then it was subsequently increased to the $530,000 per year in the next biennial budget.
Right.
And at that time, I believe there were conversations and per the report that money was going to be ending. They hadn't planned to put it into the 14-15 budget, and then the Good Will-Hinckley board presented a 2-year weeding business plan, if you would, to be independent of the state money after the 14-15 budget.
I'm confused on dates. My understanding was this would continue for 2 years up until next year as well. The funding would continue. That was the understanding.
That's under the current contract
Oh,
that
right.
they've just signed.
Right, okay.
Okay.
Some of this I'm not, this is more from the goodwill side, they would be able to tell you, but all I can tell you is what our understanding and the conditions were for our grant agreement, which really required state funding, and our consultant had said that stabilization of that revenue stream or finding a replacement was a challenge for the school that it needed to meet, and we expected it to meet the challenge.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Other questions? Chairman Kruger and then Representative DeShane.
Thank you, and thank you very much for coming, Mr. Powell. We really appreciate it. If point A is the governor can't abide the Good Will-Hinckley hiring decision, and point B is the Harold Alfond Foundation pulls a significantly larger amount of money from Good Will-Hinckley, how did you get from point A to point B?
We didn't get to point B. We never pulled money, and we never said we were going to pull money.
Then how, so it was just the threat or a possibility of it that caused Goodwill to...
No, maybe I'm misunderstanding your question. The Harold Alfond Foundation never threatened to pull our funding. What happened was the governor said he was withdrawing support, and then I spent a week or so trying to figure out what that really meant.
Right.
And when I was satisfied that it likely meant that nobody was going to patch up and make things work, at that point I was worried because there was $1 million or more over the next 2 years that wasn't going to come the school's way, and so that's why I wrote the letter. But in my letter, I wanted to be clear in the letter, and I've been clear. We put it out on our webpage and whatnot. My board had never met. We had never decided to pull funding. We were just doing what's in our contract. Our contract says we're going to give you this money. We expect you to keep your budget and your enrollment, growing enrollment, reaching more kids. We don't want to expand the Moody School and then not have the kids to fill it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative DeShane.
Thank you very much, Senator. I guess I want to make sure the statement that's in the OPEGA report is accurate. And basically it says that by the time the June 18th letter was sent, it was clear the support was the $530,000. Initially, you had the governor's disappointment, and then it becomes clear that we're talking the money's going to go away. What was it that allowed you to conclude that, yeah, we're talking about the money?
Even at the time I wrote the letter, you may have noted from my letter, I used the word likely.
Yeah.
I thought somehow maybe people could fix it because the school, to me, was the most important thing. And I thought, wouldn't this be nice if we could still get the money? So it was likely. But it seemed to me that based on the investigation that I did, the people that I talked to, that it was within the governor's range of possibilities that he would not support the school. And there was conversation between me and Jack Moore. I called Glenn Cummings to talk with him about it a little bit. And I arrived at the conclusion that this was something that was very likely to happen, and for that reason, I wrote the letter.
And that's because everybody you talked to said, yeah, we're probably talking about the money.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
But I don't want to mislead you. I thought about the money too. It was almost, first thought. I wasn't quick enough to say, well, Governor, what are we talking about dollars? All right, I didn't do that on the call. I should have, probably. I didn't.
Thank you. Senator Diamond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nice to see you again, Greg. Nice to see you all. Based on what you and, first off, is your board a citizen board just appointed by whomever? How does your board create itself?
Well, our board was selected by Mr. Alfond, and we had to add a few others.
Over time.
He wasn't around. There was a lot more work to do. So it was a lot harder to get the work done.
Would it be fair to say that your understanding and the board's understanding that without the $530,000, the school probably would not survive?
No, I think it would have survived, but it wouldn't have kept on track. And it would have been a concern because it would have wasted our money. We'd already spent $2.7 million. The school had already incurred major cost to expand the Moody School, and it wouldn't have the kids to fill it. So we wanted to see them. We wanted to find out where they're going to get $500,000 if the legislature didn't give them, the $500,000. And if there was gonna be delay in getting the 500,000, what was the plan? You know, how would we move forward? That's what we wanted to know.
And without that plan, you saw it spiraling down,
Yes.
because the plan would include a replacement of $530,000.
Or it would require compromises in the way the school did business. And it certainly would have made it much more difficult to get to 210 students, which under the business models was where they needed to be in order to be self-sustaining and, you know, without further state support.
What would have been your time frame for that plan?
I thought 2 years, which was and even then, I mean, I can't tell you this day that the school might not, you know, need help. I mean, not every plan is perfect, but that was what we were relying on, and that's why we entered the grant agreement that we did and did it the way we did it.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you. Other questions of Mr. Powell? Seeing none, thank you very much for being here. It's nice to see you.
Thank you, appreciate it.
I'm sorry? Yes, I'm sorry. Did you produce all the documents you requested to for the our presentation to be here?
I did.
Thank you very much. We've now completed our list of people we've either subpoenaed or asked to come here today. So the statute, or our rules at least, do provide for an opportunity for our committee to ask to recall any witnesses who previously testified. I'm not sure all of them are here. Is there any such request from the committee? I'm seeing none. Our rules also provide that any who has testified here today would now have an opportunity to provide further or clarifying information for the committee. Is there anyone here who has testified who would like to provide any further or clarifying information to the committee? Seeing none. The next matter on our agenda then is to vote on what the record is going to be of this hearing. And is there a motion with respect to that? Chairman Kruger.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. In accordance with Title III, Section 429, I would move that testimony shall be released only as a full audio recording of the testimony today.
Is there a second for that motion? Seconded by Representative Rocky. Is there discussion with respect to that motion? Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just so I can understand the decision we're making, what are the alternatives to that?
Well, another alternative might be that at the expense of the government oversight for what we would pay the budget, we could decide to have a full transcript prepared, which would probably be at a cost in thousands of dollars, not the hundreds. If anybody else wants to have such a transcript made, they can certainly access the audio tape themselves and have it made. But query whether it's a wise use of taxpayer money for us to be doing what we don't need to. Senator Johnson.
And that makes sense to me. I wonder whether if someone does wish to cover the cost of transcription, we might then be able to make that available to others. Our motion as it stands, I think, would include doing that.
I don't think so, because we're making this the official record of the hearing, so the official record would be, I think, our definition available to me.
Great, thank you.
Representative Sampson?
And once that is released as audio, that means anybody who chooses to may disseminate that information in any form of media they wish.
Absolutely. Further discussion on the motion? All in favor of the pending motion, please indicate. All opposed? It's unanimous. So we're now at the point where there could be a sense of work session to discuss the testimony we've heard, to ask staff any questions we wish to, and then to decide what, if any, further action the committee is going to take. It's now 5 minutes past 4. And I know a number of people have commitments in the not too distant future here. And so what is the pleasure of the committee? I might suggest that perhaps we adjourn for today and re-meet sometime soon, not at our next scheduled meeting, but at a special meeting to discuss those things and to conclude this matter so we can move on to the other important work this committee has before us. Moved by Representative Campbell that we recess for the day and discuss reconvening the committee at an early opportunity. Is there a second? Second. Discussion of the motion? Representative
I
Biscotty,
just
Senator
want to
Burns.
say that I won't be back in the country after Saturday until December 3rd. And I would really appreciate being there.
Other discussion on the motion? Senator Burns, I'm sorry.
Thank you. I was just going to make a pitch for next week, but I don't want to see us reconvene on this unless every one of us is here. I think that's extremely important. The Senator's coming in on the 19th, so I saw this as an opportunity the day before to my benefit. But that's not going to happen. So
As soon as I get back, I mean, I'm coming December 3rd.
Okay.
So I refer to when we all.
Well, December 3rd is a Thursday. Do people have their calendars with them so we can see if that works now?
I'll be back the night before, so I'll get myself up here.
Do you want to take a look at your calendars and see? December 3rd? Yes. Yep. That's good. Just wait a moment here. People look.
I'm good. Will this be in the morning?
You could be in the.
Is that the only item we're going to have?
On that day? Senator, Representative Simpson, right? Senator Burns?
There were many other days that we're going to be here in December
I'm not.
as a legislature.
I'm not. There is a bill signing day.
It's in November.
17th. Bill signing day is December 17th, but that is over a month from now. Right. All right, so we will reconvene on December 3rd at 9 o'clock. Is that the pleasure of the group?
Is this going to be our December meeting, or are we going to have another meeting in December as well?
Beth, you want to weigh in on that, please?
Well, you have a lot of pending work that has been sitting, and I don't know, it's always nice to get as much done in the interim as we can, because once you get back in session, it's sometimes hard to push through that. You have yet to hear from Judge Wathen and Superintendent Pepper about the Riverview situation. We have a discussion about economic development programs that we started. You still have not talked about New Markets tax credit and what you want to do about that. There's one other thing that I'm not remembering right at the moment. I think you have at least 5 items that you could work on.
The idea that I don't think this is going to take the morning to conclude. So why don't we ask that to put a full agenda for consideration? Third. Other issues? Yes, Representative Shane.
Thank you. You'll hate this thought, but we don't all have to be here for discussion of some of the other issues. We're going to meet while Representative Mastracchio is in Italy. We could get some work done prior to it, and I'm just throwing that out for consideration.
You were accurate in your guess, at least.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
I hear a lot of enthusiasm. Senator Diamond?
Mr. Chairman, do we have a date in December, that's my mind, for a regular meeting?
Other than the third.
Okay, so if we met on the 3rd, did some of those things on the 3rd after we have our primary purpose meeting, and then another time in December, we can finish up the rest of it, would that make sense?
Rather than taking days for, especially those who have to travel, not many here are as fortunate as Senator Cates and I, who just live right around the corner, that I would rather do just one long day and get it done.
Are there any holidays in December?
Oh,
There is one. So December 3rd, we'll have plan on a full day.
We'll put the priority things on, and if the rest rolls over to January, we'll be all right.
Okay, so that's what we're planning. So anything else to come before us this afternoon, Beth?
Nope. Nothing for me.
All right, we will, is there a motion to adjourn? Second. All in favor? Call this meeting of the.
Sorry.
Hold on.
No, we already adjourned. We adjourned.
Ed reminded me, you have not voted on the meeting summary from last meeting, if you would, just so we could get it posted.
Moved by Senator Burns and seconded by Representative Campbell.